Welcome, dear listener. I am David Tate.
And I'm Sean Powell.
And we invite you to join us as we start talking through the text, exploring what Scripture does and doesn't say, so that we can think biblically, live biblically, and be part of the solution that this world so desperately needs.
Dust off your sandals and strap on your tassels as we climb up the mountain to unlock the 5 books of Torah in Season 1, the Sinai Sessions.
Today we are going to be talking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8, otherwise known as Parashah Bereshit, the first weekly Torah portion in the yearly cycle of whenever Jewish people read through the Torah. And so this one, I'm going to warn y'all ahead of time, this episode is probably going to go a bit long. I don't know yet. We're just now starting it, but I've got a sneaky suspicion it's going to go a bit long, and that is because we are covering we are covering what is literally the foundational chapters in not only the Torah, but in the Bible as a whole. Yeah. And it sets everything in motion. And so if we go long, hopefully we're having good enough conversation to keep your attention.
Hopefully.
But Sean, how have you been enjoying reading through these chapters? Obviously, it's not your first time reading them, but...
Yeah. No, it's been great because it's just going slower and going... And approaching it from a slightly different a way than we usually do, trying to read it from the perspective of the immediate audience of Israelites in the wilderness, and having to try to step in their shoes. That's just a different approach than we typically take.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to have you expand on that real quick, because we did talk about this in our first episode. If you haven't seen that, that's just why should we study the Torah. But today, since we are actually jumping into the text, starting in Genesis chapter 1, real quick, just recap for us why we are specifically reading it from the perspective that you just talked about. Because one thing that I want us to try to keep in mind as we go throughout this whole thing is that we need to do our very best. And one of the most challenging aspects to Bible study in general is getting out of your own head and trying to step into the minds of the original readers. And so who is the audience that we're trying to, our best, to step into the minds of? Why are we doing that? And what reason do we have for believing that they might have been the original audience, I guess?
Yeah.
No, that's a lot of questions.
I'll try my best. So first of all, as Christians, it's just a common mistake sometimes that we read the Old Testament as in general, but also the Torah through our own lens, like in a Christian lens. And that already, it's not the worst thing, but it can lead to just missing a lot of the depth of Torah because we jump straight to Jesus, where it's like, oh, this, Jesus, oh, this, Trinity. Whereas whenever you're reading any text, you want to first consider the immediate audience and therefore context. And probably the two most important things of context is the writer and the audience. Mm-hmm. And we have good reason to believe people, obviously, as we talked before about debate, but most likely Moses wrote the Torah, and the Torah itself seems to think that. Mm-hmm. And so if Moses wrote it, then that means that he had to have been writing to Israelites that were in the wilderness. And so Genesis would be kind of like a prologue to the rest of the Torah, which would be basically contemporary history for the audience.
Yeah. And so a few things that you kind of addressed there. One thing that we do know is that, Jesus makes it clear in the New Testament that the Torah and all the Hebrew scriptures do ultimately point to him. And so there is a good reason to read Jesus back into the Old Testament, but to the point that you're making, sometimes Christians almost do this to their own detriment, to where they fail to actually read the Hebrew scriptures on their own, to just try to see what it's understanding. Like they make everything Christological, which again isn't inherently bad until you fail to understand all the verses around it, right? We talked about this last week. Like people have there's certain messianic quotation verses that they like to bring up, right? Oh, there's these certain passages in the prophets that people love to quote and say, oh, that's about Jesus. But you're only going to understand how it is about Jesus if you understand the surrounding context. You've got to understand, because technically anybody can go into a text and say, oh, well, this is about me, by taking it out of context. And so we want to figure out, is this actually about Jesus? I believe that it is. And so we have to do that by reading it in its original context. And then another thing we talked about last week, and you kind of addressed this, there's always debate about when the Torah was written, when it came to its final, how it currently is, its final structure and everything. But the way that we're going to be reading it is specifically through the lens that it presents itself, right? So setting all the scholarly debates aside, we're simply going to look at this from the perspective of, well, the book itself presents itself like it is being written by Moses. The rest of history calls them the books of Moses. And since Moses is the reported author, he would have had to write this during the time period when the Israelites are in the wilderness. And so we're going to read it through that lens. Because I think that when you do that, as we'll see today, there are certain insights that will come to the forefront that will actually help us understand, first off, just later commandments in Torah itself, but also just certain things about the story of Scripture that maybe we miss whenever we're only reading it from a 21st century Western American evangelical lens.
Yeah.
And so that being said, there's our introduction. Let's actually open up and jump into Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Alrighty. This is one of those verses that everybody has memorized because it's usually one of the first verses you learn as a child. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right, we're not going to be going verse by verse through every single passage here, but I do think that it might be worth some time to just like to set aside some time to talk about this verse in particular. What are some things that stick out to you right off the bat from this first verse?
Well, it says in the beginning, so in the beginning God, and so first of all, this is like God predates time, like he's before creation.
Yeah, so the idea is just that whenever we think in the beginning, and I guess you could always argue that they're just saying in the beginning of the story, but if you keep reading literally to the end of the verse, it makes it clear that this is talking about the creation of everything, right?
Yeah.
So in the beginning, before anything was, he already was there. That's going to be significant to something we talk about later on. But then what else do you notice about how God is, how do I say this? Hopefully you probably know where I'm heading with this. How is he described?
As a creator?
He's a creator, but specifically, what is he named?
I got you. Yeah. He doesn't really have like a specific name.
Yeah, he isn't given a name, and to me that's interesting.
Yeah.
There is debate amongst scholars because whenever you flip to Genesis chapter 2, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, God is given a name, and he is called Yahweh God. And whenever you go on through the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, God is called by the name Yahweh, and he is identified as the God of Israel. And so a lot of scholars and skeptical scholars, they'll look at this and they will say, oh, well, this is evidence that these documents were, they were separate documents that were stitched together. And so Genesis chapter 1, he is simply called Elohim, God. But then in chapter 2, he's called Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh God. And maybe they're right. I don't think so. For me, my perspective is I'm wanting to say, is there a reason why the author might have for not putting Yahweh's name in the beginning of chapter 1 and saving it for later on?
Yeah.
Because the Hebrew word Elohim is just the general term for supernatural beings in the ancient Near Eastern world. And so he just says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Why do you think that might be?
Well, there could be a lot of reasons. It could be, firstly, it could be that it's referring to like a collective creation where it's not just Yahweh who's actually participating, and then later on it's going to clarify like Yahweh God is the one who is like actually overseeing it. Another thing too that you see like in movies is oftentimes like there is this like delay of like it's suspense,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in this case, it would just put off like you would see God doing what he's doing, and you're just waiting for like the writer or the to like name drop basically. And
Yeah, you're like reading the story and you're saying, who is this guy?
Yeah.
And then he says, Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Yeah, that could be it.
Yeah.
One thing let me return to the question of the whole original audience. So we've talked about the Israelites dwelling in the wilderness, right, after the whole Exodus from Egypt and stuff. And if you don't know that story, we're going to get to it eventually as we walk through Torah because it shows up in the book of Exodus. But if the Israelites in the wilderness are the original audience, what are some of the questions that they are wrestling through? Like, what are the main questions that Moses needs to answer for them in the book of Genesis?
Well, first of all, who is Yahweh and what is Israel?
Mm-hmm.
So, why are the people in the wilderness, and like what is their goal? Those are probably the biggest questions.
Yeah, so Moses' whole thing in the wilderness is he is establishing them as a nation, right? You're supposed to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. The people of Israel are wondering, who are we? Why are we? Where are we going? Why are we going there? And Moses, throughout Torah, he is providing a single answer for all those questions. God, right? God is the reason why you are. God is the reason where you're going, right? God is the answer to all these questions. You exist because of God. All this stuff is true because of God. But then the question becomes, well, what is so special about our God, right? If we're going into the land of Canaan, well, they have gods too. Why do we believe that our God has given us the right to possess this land?
Yeah.
Why is it that we should renounce all the other gods for the sake of this one God, right? That becomes the big question. And so to me, it seems like Genesis chapter 1, Moses is answering that question by saying, let me show you what sets your God apart from all the other gods. And one way he does that is by not telling us his name right off the bat, right? Instead, he just simply says God. And I think a reason for doing that is because it allows us to not simply identify Israel's God by his name, but by his actions, right? A spoiler alert for whenever we actually learn his name. I mean, we're going to see it in Genesis chapter 2, but the name is going to be explained in the book of Exodus. His name just means he who is, basically, right? It's the third person version of I am who I am. And so Yahweh just means he who is. It's not like this crazy fantastical name. And so I think what we see in Genesis 1 is that Moses is saying the way you'll know that your God is set apart is by what he does. And so he says, let's just call him God for now. And let me show you who he is. And then once you understand who he is, then I'll tell you his name. And so by the time you get to Genesis 2, you understand who God is, what his goal is in the world. And then you zoom in and you get a much more intimate portrait where like this unknowable God introduces himself. That being said, I'm wearing a Superman shirt right now. Superman, he's like, as a character, he has existed for less than 100 years, but there have been a lot of iterations of that character, right? He was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster back in 1938. And over the course of the last several decades, he has become an American icon that has been adapted into various different comic books, graphic novels, movies, TV shows, radio shows, etc. My question to you, Sean, is this. How do you distinguish one version of Superman from another? How do I know the difference between David Cornsweat's Superman, Henry Cavill's Superman, and Christopher Reeve's Superman?
Usually by the appearance.
So the appearance, but even then, right? This is not a trick question.
Yeah.
So how do I understand the distinctions between their appearances? What do I have to do? Not a trick question.
Like to look at them.
You have to look at them, and what do you have to do as you're looking? You have to compare one to another.
Yeah,
right? That's the whole thing, right? If I want to know what makes Henry Cavill's Superman different than Christopher Reeve's Superman, what I have to do is I have to examine both of them, and I have to compare them to see what values make them different, what looks make them different, how do people treat them. That is what makes them different. And so I would argue that the best way to understand Genesis chapter 1 and the creation of the world is not by simply reading it through a modern 21st century lens and saying, ooh, does this tell me how old the universe is? Instead, it's by saying, well, let's compare this to the other ancient Near Eastern, ancient Near East is just like the whole region where like Israel and stuff was at, if you're wondering. Let's compare it to the other ancient Near Eastern creation myths and see what Moses might be saying about this God versus the other gods.
Yeah.
Because I would say that that's what the Israelites would be doing, right? They'd be looking at this, and keep in mind, they just came from Egypt, right? They're surrounded by all these other cultures who have their own religions.
Yeah.
And so they're wondering what makes our God different. And Moses says, let's go back to the beginning and let me tell you how things actually unfolded. Right? And so what I've got right here is I have got a list of some of the things that we can highlight here that just contrast Genesis chapter 1 with the creation myths of other religions at that time. And one thing I probably do need to clarify ahead of time is that one thing that makes the Hebrew religion unique is that they had a canonized mythology or a canonized religion, if that makes sense. Whenever you look at, or do you want to explain what exactly I mean by that?
No, that's okay.
Okay. When I say that they have a canonized religion, what I mean is that the Hebrew people throughout history, they're very unique in the sense of they documented their beliefs, they wrote them down, and there were no alternate versions, right? I mean, there is no alternate version of Genesis out there, right? They wrote it down, they passed it along, and sure, there might be manuscript like variations and stuff, but by and large, it's the same story, right? And there was a continuous stream of canonical thinking in the terms of the Hebrew people, to where there was an authoritative texts of documents that they could look to as the foundation of their religion. You do not see that in other ancient Near Eastern religions, like the Canaanites and the Mesopotamian, like the Babylonians and Assyrians and stuff. They had different mythologies and they had different belief traditions, but we have different versions of stories circulating throughout there, right? So some of those we've discovered, right? We've got like the Enuma Elish, and what else we have? We have the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Heliopolitan creation myth. We've got all these different things. The Memphite theology, those are some things down in Egypt. But these are all different versions of the same story, right? The Egyptians, the Babylonians, they did not have a single canonical story that they passed down.
Yeah.
And so that's actually beneficial to us, because what we can do is we can look at these other ancient documents that we've discovered, and we can find common denominators between them. And we can say, okay, well, this is what generally creation looked like to the ancient Near Eastern mindset. Now, what is Moses saying that is different? And so that's actually really cool for us, because again, the Hebrew people had one thing, like this is Genesis 1 is their one creation story. Like that is it. And then you have spins on it throughout the rest of the Bible. And so what we can do is we can speak in general about the other ancient Near Eastern religions, and then we can talk about Genesis chapter 1. And so real quick, I'm just going to go through these pretty quick, just so we can move on. But whenever you look at the other myths in ancient Near Eastern religions, those are usually a combination of cosmogony and theogony. Cosmogony being the origin of the universe, and theogony being the origin of the gods. Mm-hmm. But like you already pointed out, the Genesis 1 account is only a cosmogony, right? We read in chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So right off the bat, in the very first verse, you're seeing a very big difference between what Moses is establishing and what the other religions believed, right? Because Moses is saying, well, the God already existed, right? He predates creation, right? The other myths, they position that the gods are part of creation, whereas Moses argues that God is set apart from creation. This is the word that eventually we will call holy, right? Holy means to be set apart. Whenever you look at the other religions, their gods are represented by the sun, the moon, the stars, the water, like the trees. It's all very physical, and their gods are part of creation. They're not saying that their gods are literally the trees, but when you look at their myths, that's how it starts, right? We're going to talk about this, but the gods are literally like the chaotic waters that produce creation. Whereas in Moses' account, God is set apart. He is entirely different. The other myths present there as being several different gods who are named to distinguish from one another, right? So you have Tiamat and Apsu and Marduk, and they are all explicitly named because they need to be distinguished. But whenever you actually look at them, there's not really much setting them apart, right? They basically all have the same rash character. They're all very human and petty and vindictive, and they just like competing with one another for glory. Mm-hmm. And then whenever you look at the creation accounts, there's just one of them who ends up on top, and usually that is the patron deity of the tradition that was passed down. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Moses' account, there is only one God, to the fact that he doesn't even have to be named in the first chapter, right? Just in the beginning, God. Which God? The God, right? The one true ultimate Elohim of Elohims, like the God. And he is distinct in every way, and he's distinct not simply by his name, but by his actions. Fourthly, in other myths, there are multiple gods who create the universe through divine conflict and warfare, right? Basically, creation ends up being an accident, to where they're just fighting each other, and whoops, there's creation. Whereas when you look at Genesis 1, there's one God who creates the universe by the power of his word, right? And God said, let there be light, and there was light.
It's very intentional.
Yeah, it's very intentional, right? Which leads to the fifth point. Gods compete with one another for primacy in the other accounts, whereas there is no competition in Genesis chapter 1. There is one God with supreme authority, no competition. Sixthly, in the other accounts, creation is accidental and chaotic. I already kind of addressed this, right? They're fighting with one another, and whoops, we accidentally created dry land. Whoops, we accidentally created trees. Whereas whenever you read Genesis 1, creation is purposeful and ordered. Yeah. Seventhly, in other accounts, creation is born from chaotic waters, producing accidental offspring. This is especially true in the Enuma Elish, which is like the Babylonian creation epic. This is actually really fun for a wordplay that we see in Genesis, where the chaotic waters, there's two of them. There's Apsu and Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, and Tiamat is like the salt water, and she is ultimately like basically these two are going to produce creation, and she is going to be split in two later on to produce like the waters below and the water above. When you read Genesis chapter 1, I believe it's in verse 2, it says the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Hebrew word for deep there is tehom. which is like etymologically related to Tiamat. And so here you have this deep figure showing up, and it is the chaotic waters, but instead of the chaotic waters being a god that produces creation, it is simply the chaotic waters that God subdues to produce creation on his own, right? And so in Genesis' account, God subdues the chaotic waters, producing intentional boundaries. So it's not accidental. He's intentionally separating things.
Mhm.
Eighthly, in the other myths, celestial bodies are gods to be worshipped, right? So whenever you get the sun, the moon, and the stars, these are all gods that you worship, right? In the Enuma Elish, you've got the god, who is it? It's Nanar is the goddess of the moon, and then Shamash is the god of the sun. Whereas whenever you get to Genesis chapter 1, they're just other parts of creation, right? These are not gods to be worshipped. He just creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they serve a purpose in creation, but they are not like gods that you worship.
Yeah. Mhm.
Ninthly, in other myths, humans are created as an afterthought, mainly for the purpose of labor. Basically, the gods are like, oh man, we made all this stuff. What are we going to do? Well, you know what? What if we created humans and they could do the work for us so that we could go have fun in heaven? Whereas in Genesis chapter 1, humans are the climax and the purpose of creation, given dominion over the earth. And so in one version, basically, a creation is a burden that is placed upon the humans, whereas in Genesis chapter 1, creation is a gift that is given to the humans, which is a pretty big difference.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah. Tenthly, in other accounts, humans are slaves and only the kings are divine, right? Sometimes the kings might be called sons of God. Whereas in Genesis chapter 1, all humans, male and female, are made in God's image. That's a pretty big deal as well. Like the fact that it's male and female, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
11thly, in other accounts, gods are represented by graven images, right? So you've got statues of wood and metal and stone. Whereas in Genesis chapter 1, which we'll have to talk about this because I think sometimes people misunderstand this, but the living God is being represented not by graven images, but by living images. Humans themselves are the image of God, which is crazy. But the difference is that they're not supposed to be worshipped, which we'll talk about that. And then 12thly and lastly, the way that the other myths culminate is by the gods basically just partying in heaven, right? Like I said, they create humans so that they can go back to doing what they want to do up in this heavenly realm. Whereas the way that Genesis 1 culminates is by the one true God coming to rest in his metaphorical temple on earth. And so all of that stuff to me is really cool. And if you read it in that context, I think it will shape how you inherently interpret the story. Thoughts?
Well, again, whenever you especially are considering the immediate audience, it says a lot to the people of Israel, or the Hebrew people, who were in the wilderness, who exactly they're following, and what it means for them.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to cover that, and I know I went a little bit longer there, but it's because I just see really the books of Genesis and Revelation, I think, are probably some of the most mishandled books in the Bible. Ironically, because they deal with the beginning and the end, and that's what every human naturally wants to understand.
Yeah.
Right? Humans want to know, how did all things start and how are all things going to end? And therefore, we just get kind of weird whenever we get to these books. And I'm not suggesting that Genesis isn't addressing those questions. I'm just saying that is not the chief most thing that Moses was trying to address. For instance, if I was wanting to tell my life story, I would not start in the beginning of all things. The only reason I'm bringing up the beginning of all things is if it somehow directly impacts the story I'm trying to tell right now. And so, again, to bring up Superman, the only reason most Superman stories begin with the destruction of Krypton is because that is going to inherently shape how you understand Superman as a character, right?
Yeah.
It's not simply giving you needless backstory. So Moses isn't simply going back to the beginning because he wants to be like, hey, you want to know how all things started? He's going back there because if you look at how things began, he's saying, this is how your God is different than the other gods. And so let me ask you this. Given the things that we just talked about there, how is Israel's God being depicted as different than the other gods?
Well, in a lot of ways, probably the simplest way to put it is that he is just obviously more supreme and he is more in control. Like everything, a lot of the distinguishing factors between God here and the other gods is like control and order. Like God here is intentional. He's not creating things by accident, and he has purpose behind everything. Whereas when creation's happening on accident and there's a lot of infighting and like the other gods don't seem very much in control of things. And so again, this says something for the Israelite people when they're following, like they're being told to listen to the commands of this God, that he just saved them through Egypt, out of Egypt. And he's trying to tell them that he is greater than the gods of Egypt, and he is greater than the gods of Canaan. He is the one who is in control. Yeah.
Yeah. So on one hand, you see that God is being depicted as greater and far superior to all the other gods, which makes sense given that, I mean, like Moses' whole claim is that there is one God that you devote all your attention to. That explains why, right? Our God is, like, he's not just another God. He is the one who created everything, right? He makes your gods look puny, right? You think that Tiamat gave birth to creation? No. Our God subdued Tehom, and he used it to just help design his creation. You think that you worship the sun, moon, and the stars? No, those are things that God just put in the sky to decorate things and help us, like, dictate time. And so he is elevating God, and he's showing how supreme God is. But then the surprising twist is how God treats humans, right?
Yeah,
because in all the other accounts, humans are just an afterthought. And so, perplexingly, Moses has elevated God to being way, like, if the other gods are here, like, the God of Israel is way up here. But from the other perspective of, like, the other creation accounts, if humans are down here, well, that means that the span between humans and God in Genesis is even bigger. But for some reason, this great big God of the universe, he cares a lot for these humans. And I think that's what's supposed to be so surprising. Yeah. Because, like you kind of addressed, it's very clear that this God from the beginning has a design, right? Whenever you read the other creation accounts, things are just accidentally happening to where when you're reading it, there isn't a clear structure. Whereas Genesis 1 is literally just poetry, right? There's a very clear structure and a rhythm to all of this stuff. And we'll probably address that in a second. But there's a very clear rhythm to where you can tell that creation is a design by God. And whenever somebody is designing or creating something, you have to ask, why are they creating it? What are they doing this for? What is the end goal? Yeah. Like whenever, I don't know, like, have you ever seen like those like speed paintings that people do whenever they're painting it upside down and they flip it? Yeah. Those always amaze me because you can tell that the artist has a very intentional goal, but as a viewer, you cannot perceive the goal till the very end. Mm-hmm. And as you're watching Genesis 1 unfold, that's how, like, if you're getting sidetracked by the how old is the earth question, you're going to miss what's going on here. You see this God who has a very clear design, and that's unlike any of the gods from the other religions. And you have to ask, wait a second, if creation was intentional, what was the goal behind creation, right? Because the other accounts just make it seem like, oh, this was accidental, and so there doesn't have to be a goal. Whereas if this God is so powerful that he can speak these things into existence, what was his purpose for speaking? Why is he doing things this way? What is the goal that he's trying to accomplish by the end of this? And then you get to the end of day 6, or what you think is the end of day 6, right? He creates the beasts. And we'll talk about how this kind of breaks the structure in a second. But you expect it to say, and God saw, and behold, it was good. And then it would normally say, and there was evening and morning the 6th day. Yeah. But then God says, and let us make man in our image. And you're like, whoa, it breaks the structure. And you're like, wait, what's going on here? And then he says, and let us make him as our image and as our likeness, and let him have dominion over the earth. And you're like, wait a second, did he create all of this stuff just to give it to man? To where all of a sudden, instead of man being an afterthought to do the slave work of the gods, the whole reason God made all this stuff was to give it to him. And that changes how you read it, because all of a sudden, this great big God, who he has no reason to care for man, for some reason, he elevates man above everything else. And he doesn't want man to be an equal. That will be very clear. But for some reason, he wants man to participate with him. And then the story culminates not with God dwelling way up here, but with him coming to rest with man in creation. Yeah. To where then you flip to Genesis 2, and you've got them walking together in the garden. And so I think that is really cool. That being said, since I've talked so much, what are some things that stuck out to you as we were just reading through the chapter itself?
Yeah, there were a few things. I do think we already talked about it, but I do think that it's important to take note of the theme of like order coming out of chaos, because that's going to be something that's going to be throughout Torah. That's going to ultimately culminate in the Exodus, where you literally have chaotic waters and the people being delivered through the Red Sea, and out of it is going to become a nation. So there is like literally order out of chaos. And then, I think probably the biggest thing for me was the the fact that he creates man, and he literally says, "I've given to you every plant, every beast. You have dominion over the earth and multiply." And it's just very, very different because it's not a place of enslavement; it's a place of exaltation. So it's like he has made man king over the earth, but not just like one guy who's the one writing the story. It's mankind. Mankind is the one who's having dominion. Like there is no, I mean, God is going to be their king essentially, but as far as man goes, there is no like human king over the other humans.
Yeah. Which again is just very shocking whenever you compare it to the other religions at the time, where, and you see this even like to the New Testament times when you get to like the Romans and stuff, you got like the son of the divine Tiberius or son of divine Augustus, to where it's usually the kings and the emperors who are elevated to the status. Whereas it seems like, according to the design that Moses is establishing in Genesis, God's original design was that all humanity was to function like kings and priests. The elevation of certain humans over others, as we're going to see, that's a result of the fall, to where like eventually there's going to be this sense of competition where people try to make a name for themselves. That'll be kind of tie into to next week's passage. But in God's original design, humanity was supposed to be equal, male and female, to where all of them are exalted as kings and queens of his creation, who are in some way sharing his dominion.
Yeah.
And
also when you get to like, again, like the wilderness and stuff, when they're getting into the promised land, just like how Moses kind of predicts that they will ask for a king, this kind of answers like why they're not supposed to have a king as well, because as we read later on, God was supposed to be their king. It's the same thing here, except on top of that, it is like as if they are meant to be kings, all be kings already, in the same way that when God says do not make graven images, part of that reason is because they are the images.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that later on when we get to Deuteronomy, and well, I guess it's going to be even later on when you get to Samuel, and they're like, we want a king, and Samuel's like all frustrated. And that goes back to Deuteronomy, where Moses says, you're eventually going to ask for a king, and here's the rules. But you're saying that the original design, why Israel wasn't supposed to have a king, kind of ties back to this whole thing. Mm-hmm. Like to where if an Israelite in the wilderness is reading this passage, they're realizing, oh, we are all equal, and the only person who should truly be above us is God. And I think that actually ties into Exodus 2. Whenever you look at the original design that God lays down for the Israelite people, you are supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So he doesn't even say that y'all are supposed to be like above the other nations. You're simply supposed to be a set apart nation who serves the purpose of mediating between me and humanity. But he's not saying that y'all are like, y'all aren't just like a priesthood of kings. You're a kingdom of priests, if that makes sense. But
exactly.
One other thing, just because we haven't like walked through the text itself as much, I just want to highlight certain patterns. One thing that I think it's really good to do as we read through any scripture is just look for patterns in the text. And Genesis 1 is probably one of the easiest passages to do that, because even though it is a narrative, it follows a clear patterned or like poetic structure. And I think that there are certain themes and messages that are layered in there. And it seems like we're spending a lot of time on Genesis 1. That's because we are. It's foundational, right? It establishes everything. And so some of the patterns, whenever you're reading through the chapter, and really I'm including the first 3 verses of chapter 2 as well, because for some reason we decided to split off chapter 1 at the end of day 6 and not into day 7. That baffles me. Anyways, every day begins with the phrase, and God said, right? What God says always comes to pass. Every time. There's never a time where God says something and it doesn't come to pass, which is important because, again, Moses is like, these are the verses that are shaping your understanding of who God is. For me, I can be working with my youth kids and I ask them to be quiet and they will not listen, right? God can speak light into existence and light has no choice but to listen. That's important, right? It's letting you know the power of his words versus human words. Yeah. The day cannot end until God sees what he has made and calls it good, right? There's going to be this theme that we're going to be highlighting as we go through this, the idea of God seeing something and then calling it good. This is going to foreshadow where we're heading with the end of this story in today's passage, where God is going to see his creation and find that it is evil, right? That's going to be a problem. And so I think the message behind all of this would be that God is not being haphazard. This is by design. He has an end goal and he knows how to accomplish it. And also behind all this, we see that God's eyes are the things that can see what is good, and he will not settle for less. And that's going to be relevant later on in Genesis chapter 3, whenever you see the woman sees something and she calls it good, but the thing that she is calling good with her eyes is evil in the eyes of God. And so you've got this like combating portrait of who can actually see correctly. Is it God or humanity? And the universal testimony of Scripture is that God sees correctly, and so humanity's job is to hear God. That's why the big theme throughout the Torah is the Hebrew word shema, right? To hear, right? It's not your job to see. It's your job to hear what God says and listen to him. And we're going to see the word shema show up a few times in this passage as well. There are two exceptions to the day not ending with something being good, right? The first exception is the end of day 2, where you'll notice that the phrase, "it is good," does not show up. Why do you think that is? So day 2 is whenever God separates, he separates the waters into the waters below and the water above. But then it just moves on into day 3, and it does not say it is good. What do you think the purpose of that might be? I don't have a clear answer here.
Yeah. My thoughts would be either that it's just because it hasn't been like there's more to be done. Like he has to still fill the heavens. That's whenever he creates the heavens, right?
Yeah, so that he separates the waters to where there's the waters above, water below, basically sky and sea.
Yeah. I would assume it would just have to be that it's not finished yet.
Yeah, so it seems like the general consensus is that, and I think these actually could go hand in hand, but it could be the fact that God's work is not done yet until the third day when he produces the land from the water, and so now it's like he's basically created the ecosystem, and therefore it is good. But then it also could tie into earlier in the chapter where the waters represented like chaos. And so all because he has separated the waters doesn't mean everything is good. And this is also really cool if you once again tie it back to like the Enuma Elish, where Tiamat, like Marduk is basically the one who splits her in two to produce creation. And it's almost like Moses saying, yeah, what Marduk did, that wasn't good enough, right? Yeah, you can separate Tiamat all you want. You can separate the waters, but that's not sufficient for this God. This God's going to go above and beyond because you split Tiamat, you still have chaotic waters. But it's not until you've drawn boundary lines for those waters and produced dry land that you now have order. I don't know. I don't have a clear answer there, but that's like some of the stuff that I was looking at. The second exception is in day 6, and I already highlighted this earlier, where the day does not end with the phrase, "it was good," but instead it continues going on, right? So God creates the beast of the field, and then he says, "it was good," and you would expect the day to end there, but then it continues going on. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
With day 6 and
yeah, why do you think so Moses took out and "it was good" in day 2, and he put an extra one in day 6 to where you do still have 7 "it was good" phrases, but for some reason there's 2 in day 6. Why do you think that is?
Well, I would say it has to do with him creating man, because he oh yeah, I see. He said it was good, and then he made man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like it's just because it's like building up. Because when you consider the creation as for man, once man enters the picture, image, no pun intended, that's like when things get very good.
Yeah.
And so like that's drawing attention to like why all this is happening.
Yeah, I think this highlights the literary beauty of the Bible. It's like it's a plot twist. Right? You get into the rhythm of this. You're like, okay, there was one day where it didn't end with "it was good," but by and large, every day it says, "and it was good," and there was evening and there was morning, day such and such. And so you get into that rhythm, you're kind of fitting into it, and you're kind of wondering, when is this going to end? And then it says, "it was good," and you're expecting it to say, "and there was evening and morning the 6th day." But then God says, "and let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And you're like, whoa, what's going on here? And it throws off the pattern to where all of a sudden, instead of just being stuck in the rhythm of it, you're paying attention. You're like, whoa, something's going on here. And you're like leaning in to figure out what it is. And so he says, we're going to make man. This is his purpose. This is what we're going to give him. And then he looks, and it says that all it was made, and it was very good. And it's like, oh, so like all of a sudden, man is the whole plot twist where it's like he brings creation to completion. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, whenever we talk about the David and Goliath story, Goliath is coming out there for 40 days, and he's just saying, "I dare one of y'all to come fight me. I defy the armies of Israel. I defy God." And for 40 days, nothing's changing. And then there's the one phrase in 1 Samuel 17, and I think it says like, and David heard him, and it's like, oh, like
Yep.
that's the thing that changed, right? There's a break in the pattern because the only difference was that David was there, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, Goliath's going down,
Yep.
and that's kind of how I feel with this chapter, to where there's a pattern, and then the pattern gets broken, and you're supposed to draw your attention in there, and so we do have to talk about the whole image of God thing. But let me highlight more patterns real quick. God is constantly separating things, producing order out of chaos. You already addressed this, right? But you literally see the word to separate again and again and again. And I think the message here is that God knows where things belong, and he knows proper boundaries, right? He knows where day ends and where night begins. He knows where the water ends and where the land begins. He knows where male ends and female begins, right? He knows good and evil. Right? The idea is that God is the one who establishes boundaries. He knows them. We should trust him because he's the one who, like, he designed it, right? Like, who knows the order of creation more than its designer, right? And plot twist, us humans seem to think that we do. That's where the story's heading. And so he separates light and darkness, waters above and waters below, land and sea, day and night, fish and birds, types of land animals, male and female. Those are all just different distinctions that God draws in this chapter. To where, again, it's not accidental. It's not like he's like, oh, whoops, I accidentally created male and female. No, he says, I'm going to create these, male and female. I'm going to create birds and fish. Like, he's intentionally making these things to populate the creation that he's made. And then another poetic thing, days 1 to 3 correspond to days 4 and 6. So you go back to chapter 1, verse 2, and it says, and the earth was formless and void, right? Tohu vabohu in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And basically, days 1 through 3, God is going to give the earth form, and days 4 through 6, he is going to fill the void, right?
Yeah.
So day 1, he creates light and darkness. Day 4, he puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the light and darkness. Day 2, he creates the water and the sky. Day 5, he makes the fish and the birds. Day 3, he creates the land and the vegetation. Day 6, he creates the beasts and the man, right? And so literally days 1 through 3, he is giving the earth form. And then days 4 through 6, he is filling the void. And the way I've heard people describe it is that days 1 through 3, he's building the house. In days 4 through 6, he's putting the furniture in the house, which is also interesting if you go with the imagery that we're going to be talking about in a second. Throughout this passage, God names 5 things: day, night, heaven, earth, and seas. But what I found interesting, don't have an answer for this totally, is that he only names things on days 1 through 3. After that, he doesn't name things. My theory is that it's because the things that he creates on days 4 through 6, he leaves for man to name. Like, he doesn't even name the sun, moon, like he just says the greater light and the lesser light for the sun, the moon, and stuff. And then you have all these other things, and I'm assuming it's because that is man's responsibility to name them. I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And maybe it could be Moses trying to avoid, like if he gives the sun and the moon names, then people might start calling them like gods. He's like, it's the greater light, the lesser light. That's all they are. They're just things up there that God used to tell time.
Yeah.
God blesses all living creatures, and he tells them to be fruitful and multiply. So that's like a common thing for all living things. And then another thing that people often don't talk about is that the 7th day never ends. So every single one of the first 6 days ends with the phrase, and there was evening and morning, day such and such. But whenever you get to the beginning of chapter 2, it simply says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts, and on the 7th day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then he blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work which God had created in making it. And it never says, and there was evening and morning the 7th day. And so the question becomes, is the 7th day still going on, or did it just not need to be sated and there was evening and morning the 7th day, right? That becomes like a kind of big question there. And so I have a few questions I want to turn to you now. I know we're spending a lot of time on Genesis 1. The other chapters will be quicker to go through if you understand the foundation here.
Yeah.
So first off, I would ask you, what do you think the point of the story is? Like why did Moses need to start here? Other than just establishing like God, right? I mean, he could have just said, hey, Israel, by the way, our God is bigger and better than everybody else. What is he communicating in the story itself? Like, this isn't just a poem. It is a narrative. What is the point of the story?
Well, I would say there's a couple things, but again, especially when you're thinking about where they're at and what their goal is, they're going to a land where God's going to dwell with them. First, they have to understand how God used to like dwell with man, but also in this chapter we see that he is building something, and so we have to ask, exactly what it is he's building and how that relates to man. And it's ultimately all setting up the need for Israel. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It starts heading there. Yeah.
yeah.
Especially when you talk about like whole building thing. But let me ask another follow-up question. What is God's, like if you're just reading Genesis chapter 1, what is God's purpose for his creation?
To have dominion and multiply and fill the earth and to basically take care of the earth.
Yeah, so he wants to fill the earth with like living things, right? That's important, right? So God's goal is obviously to fill the earth with life. Keep that in mind when we get to Genesis chapter 5 and you've got a genealogy that says they had kids and died. They had kids and died. They had kids and died. Something is wrong because God's goal was to fill the earth with living creatures. And specifically, he wanted the image bearers to rule over those creatures. But instead, that's not what's going to happen. And so we have God's design and how humanity is going to pervert that design. Those are important things to notice. And then finally, let's talk about day 7. This is actually going to take us back to day 6 as well. It says that God rested. Is it just because he was tired? All that talking just really, I mean, I guess he couldn't handle a podcast. He talked too much and then all of a sudden got tuckered out and had to take a nap.
Obviously.
Yeah. No, what's actually going on there? Or let me ask you this. If you're an ancient person and you hear about God's resting, there's 2 questions we have to answer. First off, where do gods rest? And when do gods rest? So where? Whenever you think of a god, where is the place that gods rest?
Typically like heaven or heavens.
Heaven or, well, in the created world.
Like a temple.
In a temple, right?
Yeah.
That would be the place where a god rests. And when and only when can that god come to rest in his temple? What has to be there from an ancient mindset?
Like idols?
An idols or an image. Right?
Yeah.
Like a temple without an image in the ancient Near Eastern mindset is just a building, right? The image has to be erected, and only after the image has been erected can the god come to rest in the building. When you read Genesis chapter 1, that is exactly what happens. But that is, again, that's where it's the biggest plot twist of all of this, right? Because Moses is saying, all these other gods, they're represented by golden calves, and they're represented by these statues of bronze and wood and stone. He says, our God cannot be represented by something so small, right? The only way that our God came to dwell in his temple is through the creation of a living and breathing image. And that living and breathing image does not exist to be worshipped because every single human who exists is that living and breathing image, right? That image exists to represent him and to share in his dominion, right? He gives man dominion over the earth, but he alone retains dominion over the heavens, which is going to be relevant later on whenever Jesus is over here just like talking to storms and it just quiets. Yeah. Because God says you have dominion over the earth, but he maintains the dominion over the heavens. And so from an ancient Near Eastern mindset, gods can only rest in their temple once an image is established. And sure enough, Genesis chapter 1, day 6, God says, let us make man. And a lot of translations say in our image. I've heard it argued, and I agree with this, that a better translation would be as our image. If you actually just look at the Hebrew there, as our image would be a better translation there. So it should be, let us make man as our image, as our likeness, and let him have dominion over the earth. And so humanity is literally meant to be the living image of the living God, not to be worshipped, but to share in his dominion and to represent him on earth. Which would also beg the question, from Genesis' perspective, what is God's temple?
Like the earth. The
earth itself, right? The whole earth itself is his temple. And if anything, the universe itself, the heavens, are the thing that is outside the temple. And that is what is so shocking about this whole thing, because God is not saying, hey, I want to dwell in this one building, in this one city. He says, no, this is my temple. Mm-hmm. And then it's only going to be because of man's rebellion that God has to do something special through Israel, where he's like, okay, let's create this tabernacle.
Yeah, but even then, he's pretty content not to have like an entire temple of his own. Like when David asked to build him a temple, he's like, I'm fine with the tabernacle. Yeah.
Well, and you'll notice that God never gives explicit instructions to build a temple, right? There's only 2 buildings that God gives instructions on, and that's the ark and the tabernacle. And then later on, humans build a temple, and he's not against it, but he is content with a tabernacle. And even whenever Solomon builds the temple, he says, we know that a building of, stone cannot contain you. The highest heavens cannot contain you. But the startling thing of this whole creation story is that God's temple is the earth, and humanity is his image. And that'd be a startling thing for any just think about how that shapes your understanding of the people around you. If you're the people of Israel, right? And then all of a sudden later on, Moses is saying hey, show love to the foreigner. Why? Well, you were a foreigner and you were a slave, but you're made in God's image. You are it's not even that you're made in God's image. You are God's image, right? You aren't bearing it. You are being God's image. And if you being God's image are going to harm another person being God's image, how do you think God's going to feel about that? Just hearing this message, it shapes things, right? It's not simply the kings and the queens of the earth who are to be honored and respected. It is every single person, even the least of these. That's pretty shocking. And so ultimately, this is going to get us into Genesis chapter 2, right?
Yeah, it almost seems like that's the culmination of God making his image and then resting in his temple. That kind of sets up chapter 2.
Yes.
Because now that I think about it, you don't get the imagery of him forming and breathing into a object to create man until chapter 2. So
Yeah.
It's that's the idol imagery. Though.
So I would argue that Genesis chapter 1 is God's creation of his temple, and whenever you get to Genesis chapter 2, it is God adorning his Holy of Holies. And so people argue that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 offer conflicting creation accounts. I don't think so. I think that when you compare them, they are telling the same story, but from different perspectives. One is a zoomed out big picture of him just, he's making the building, he's putting the furniture in there, but then you get Genesis chapter 2, and that's almost like him walking into the Holy of Holies. He's hanging the stuff on the wall. He's putting the gold on the walls and everything, and he's fashioning the Ark of the Covenant, and he's being very careful with every single thing that he is doing. And so, other thing I want to highlight here as we go into Genesis chapter 2, I got another list of notes here just about temple imagery throughout this, right? Because some people, hearing the whole notion of all of creation being God's cosmic temple, that's very foreign to how people typically read the creation story. Because typically when people read it, they immediately want to know where are the dinosaurs, what's going on with the age of the earth. That's usually what people are wrestling through.
Yeah.
Whereas I think if you read this from an Israelite perspective, it is very clear that God is saying, my end goal for the earth is to make it my temple, and I want humanity to be my image, which represent me on the earth, and I want them to fill the earth, right? That right there tells you how the story has to end, right? This story in the Bible will not be over until God's goal is accomplished, right? The only, he says that it is very good only at the moment whenever he has made his images in his temple and he can come to rest, right? That is when everything is good. And very shortly, that's going to be fractured. And the story cannot come to its end until the earth is populated by God's image who are ruling as he established, right? And it's got to specifically be with God and man dwelling together, right? But other imagery in here. There is abundant just tabernacle and temple imagery in chapters 1 and 2 as a whole. So later on when you get to Exodus and whenever you get to First Kings and then in Second Chronicles and stuff, you're going to see this imagery popping up a lot. But water, lights, vegetation, the concept of an image, precious stones, trees, cherubim, all of that stuff is going to be stuff that shows up again whenever we talk about the tabernacle and we talk about the temple.
Yeah.
And then ultimately what Moses seems to be doing here is that he is flipping the script. While other gods are content to live in the heavens and not be related to humanity at all, and the whole purpose of sacrifices in other religions is to appease the gods and to get their attention, God's goal is not that in Genesis. Instead, the God of Israel wants to make his home on earth, and by its original design, sacrifices were not necessary. Sacrifices are going to become necessary because of sin, but that was not the original design. And so in Genesis 1, he builds and furnishes his temple as this distant Elohim figure, like just God, right? But in Genesis 2, he comes to rest in the Holy of Holies, and he introduces himself to humanity as Yahweh, right? So he is no longer just God. He is Yahweh God. And so all of a sudden, if you're an Israelite reading Genesis chapter 2, you're wondering, who is this God? And Moses says, it's the God who saved you from Egypt. It's Yahweh God. You're like, oh, that's amazing. And so every temple needs a priesthood. And so in Genesis chapter 1, you see that God is doing things that priests do, right? If he is building a temple, he is the ultimate high priest. He is separating things, he is ordering things, he is blessing things, he's sanctifying things. As we're going to see in Genesis 3, he's going to sacrifice things. And then as we get into Genesis chapter 2, Adam is going to be given similar duties, right? So if God is the high priest, then Adam is also a priest, to where he is going to be given the duties to work and to keep the garden. And those are words that are in Leviticus going to be associated with Levitical priests, right? And so God's the high priest, Adam is one of his priests, and together they are working to cultivate this temple. And then, of course, for a Jewish person or a Hebrew person, if a temple is going to be inaugurated, what day is it going to be inaugurated on? What day of the week?
Like on Shabbat?
Yeah, the Sabbath day,
Yes.
right? Of course, Genesis chapter 1, of course the week culminates on the Sabbath day, right? Because that is the day that God rested, and the word Sabbath means to cease, right? God ceased from his work, and the idea is because God rests in his creation, you can rest, right? And so if you're an Israelite person reading this, the reason why you can take a day off on Saturday, which is the Sabbath day, the reason you can take a day off on Saturday is because God is at rest in his temple, and he will provide for you during that day. Just like he provided on all the other 6 days, right? By God's word, he created things and he gave us everything we needed. You can take a day off on Saturday and just trust that God will provide for you then. Why? Because he's resting in his temple. And so from a Hebrew perspective, of course, this culminated on the Sabbath day. Yeah, of course he sanctified it because he's saying, hey, don't worry, guys. I got all this. I made everything. You can trust me to keep providing for you even on this day off. Just rest and enjoy me. So if creation, or if the earth itself is God's temple, then I would argue that the land of Eden in Genesis 2 is the holy place of the temple or the tabernacle, and then the Garden of Eden, this enclosed garden, is the Holy of Holies. And just to foreshadow where we're heading with the story, by the end of Genesis chapter 3, the priests are going to be kicked out of the Holy of Holies, and they're going to be barred from entering again. And so by the end of the story, we are going to have a big problem that needs to be resolved by the end of the story, because basically we have to answer 2 questions. How are they going to regain entrance into God's presence? And secondly, what are they going to do now that they're outside of the garden? Because, spoiler alert, an image outside of a temple basically has no purpose. I mean, sure, there were household gods and stuff like that, but those are all part of pagan religions. And so whenever you remove an image from its temple, what purpose does it have anymore? And so that's going to be a question that humanity has to wrestle through. But that being said, I've talked enough. Genesis chapter 2, Sean, what are some things that you think we need to highlight here?
First, he mentions specifically the tree of the knowledge of life, or the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's going to play a big role through the rest of the story and also through the rest of Scripture. Talking about what that means and also its significance.
Mm-hmm.
And then also the whole story of why God has the creation of woman, the woman creation, and why he has man go and name the beast and stuff.
Yeah.
I would say those are probably 2 big things to talk about.
All right. Let me ask you another question. From an Israelite perspective, again, whenever we read this, we're reading this from 21st century eyes, and I think we miss a lot of the importance of the whole garden imagery and the way that God describes things. Like, for us, it feels really weird, right? We read Genesis 1, we understand it. We're like, okay, cool. We see how all these things are being made. There's the sun, the moon, and the stars. There's all this. But then all of a sudden you get to this garden, and it just going into all this detail about oh, by the way, there were these 4 rivers coming from the garden. And it gives you all this information that to us seems very random, especially so early in the story. Right? We're still in the scene where we're thinking this is still establishing things. Why is it giving us so much detail here? From an ancient Israelite perspective, dwelling in the wilderness, mind you, what might be the significance of Moses taking some time to give all this information about what the garden was like? What do you think about that?
Well, I think especially considering where they're going, first of all, it gives an idea of how good man had it. How good they had it, what man lost whenever they fell, and also what they're trying to look forward to, because ultimately Israel is meant to bring man back to God. They're a nation of priests, and so obviously we haven't got there yet through us going through these chapters, but that's what they're gonna have to look forward to, is this is what they're trying to go back to.
Yeah. So even before we talk about where they're heading, because ultimately God is going to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey, which that will be relevant. But first off, let's just start with where they're currently at, right?
Mhm.
They are currently, like, if assuming that Moses wrote this at the time period when they are in the wilderness, I would actually argue this is good evidence that he did write it at that time. Just because if you consider the fact that they are in a wilderness at this time period, this garden sounds like the best thing ever. Again, these are
Yeah.
things that we take for granted nowadays, right? We wonder, what's the big deal with there being like 4 rivers coming from this garden? And what's the deal with water coming from the ground to water it? Okay, if you're a person living in the desert, you understand the purpose of that, right? That is
Yeah.
that's a very big deal. We take this for granted because right now I've got an electrolyte drink right here and I've got another water right here. And if I wanted more water, I could walk out to the sink and I could get it.
Yeah.
Ancient Israelites did not have that luxury, right? Just to contrast how the garden is described versus how the wilderness is described in the Torah, right? These are the same collection of books. The garden is described as a fertile garden, right? Super fertile, right? So fertile that God's like, you can just have as many trees as you like, just eat as much as you want from this garden. There's so much there. By contrast, the wilderness that the Israelites are traveling through, you can still travel there to this day. It's a very harsh desert, right? There is not much there, right? The garden is described as being enclosed and protected. The wilderness is open and vulnerable, right? The Israelites are constantly getting into battles. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Sometimes they're their own worst enemies, and people from within the camp turn against them, right? But in this garden, it's enclosed, and they're protected, and God is taking care of them. In the garden, it is well watered in multiple ways, right? So it says that the Garden of Eden, like it is the source river for these 4 other rivers, which in many ways, I mean, if you translate the names of the rivers, I forget, I wrote it down somewhere. I don't think it's in my Bible here, but the translation of the names literally mean like gushing and overflowing, and so it's the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gihon, and the Pishon, right? So those are the 4 rivers. But if you just translate them, the names just mean overabundance, right? So these are rivers that are overflowing, but it says that Eden is the source water for those 4 rivers. And people will debate about like the location of the Garden of Eden and stuff. They'll say, oh, it's in modern day Iraq. But I will admit, and maybe there is a way around this, I don't know. The description of it makes it almost hard to reconcile how these 4 rivers would be together, because some of it says like it flows into the land of Cush. And the land of Cush is like very far away from like Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
And so to me, what it's more suggesting is that these 4 rivers represent all of Israel's surrounding neighbors, right? You've got the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Cushites, the Ethiopians, like you've got all these different people, and all of them, like all these like civilizations are built on mighty rivers. And God is saying, the Garden of Eden that God gave us, that was originally part of the design, where man was supposed to dwell, that was the headwater of all those other rivers, right? Like this is, so if all those nations, if you think those nations are a big deal, the Garden of Eden was better. It was more abundant. It had more water, right? By contrast, the wilderness, there's scarce water. There's bitter water. They're having to get water from rocks. There's no water all around. In the garden, they had freedom to eat in abundance, and God said, you can freely eat, right? You may eat.
Yeah.
Whereas in the wilderness, they had so little food that God has to miraculously provide food for them. And even then, God says, okay, there's a limit to how much you can have, right? You can only gather so much manna, like as you can eat on a daily basis, right? And so there's a limit on how much food you can have. Whereas the garden, super abundance, eat as much as you want.
Yeah.
In the garden, there are precious stones and greenery, whereas in the wilderness, you have rocks and sand. In the garden, you have direct divine fellowship with God, right? Whenever God comes walk in the garden, they're like, oh my gosh, we recognize that noise, because apparently God was there all the time. In the wilderness, they have to go through all this effort just to build a tent where God can come to dwell with them. But even then, there's only one guy who can go in there one day a year, right? So there is fellowship, but it's not nearly the same. And so in the garden, you have the picture of harmony, right? The word Eden literally means delight or paradise or pleasant. Whereas the wilderness is just harsh, and it's just a picture of rebellion, right? The reason they're in the wilderness for 40 years is because they rebelled. And so if you're an Israelite and you're hearing this story, you're thinking, that's what we lost, right? According to God's good design, this is what we could have had. And it was our rebellion that led us to this wilderness, right? By the end of the story, where Adam and Eve going to go? They're going to go east, and they're going to dwell in the wilderness, right? And then where's Cain going to go after he rebels? East, to dwell in the wilderness and to wander in the wilderness. And so if you're an Israelite hearing this, you're realizing, oh, God's design is good. And whenever I call something evil good and rebel against God's design, I'm going to get the same thing that Adam and Eve got.
Yeah.
And then you have Moses telling them, God is going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. And he's giving you this law, like these instructions. And if you obey the commands, it will go well with you. And if you disobey the commands, you're going to get kicked out of the land. And so if you're an Israelite, you're saying, okay, this is what we had, and God is giving us the chance to have it again.
Yeah.
We should not mess this up, right? And so if anything, the Adam and Eve story becomes even more relevant. It isn't just an introduction of sin. It is an introduction to what can be lost if you disobey the voice of God. And so to me, this is where it's like, okay, if you're reading this from an Israelite perspective, it is really like, it's becoming much more relevant to them. Moses is saying, you're about to go into this land. I'm not going to be with you, but you need to hear the voice of God. You need to shema, because if you don't shema, things are going to go poorly for you when you get in there. And so do you have anything else you want to add to that in particular?
So we can probably talk about it later, but just since you brought up all of that, all the connection there, I was also thinking about like how it also like they look back to this and they can say, okay, this is what we have to look forward to, and okay, now we need to make sure we don't mess up next time around with the covenant. But also when they look to see how exactly God deals with Adam and Eve, things like the cursing of the land and stuff, it also helps them realize that God's curses and blessings in the Torah and the covenants aren't also random.
Mm-hmm.
Like they can look back here and there's the association with like sin, exile, and the cursing of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So that whenever they look at the Torah or the Mosaic covenant, and Moses says, if you disobey, you're going to be exiled, the land's going to be cursed, there's going to be famine, there's a specific reason behind it, and that's because it goes all the way back to here.
Yeah. And so again, from their perspective, they're reading like all of this is laying the groundwork for the stuff that they read later on, like Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
To where it's a one connected story. Whereas we always read this from a very like kind of self-focused lens, where it's like, okay, well, what does it say about me? And you can learn something about this. And in fact, whenever we get to chapter 3 in a second, I'm going to highlight certain like broad principles that we can draw from it. But again, first you have to read it from their perspective, and what is it saying to the original audience? And I think to them, it is saying like, hey, this is what happened before, and if you follow God, His design is good, and He wants to give you good things. And there might be times where you think something is good, but it's not good if He said it's bad. And that's going to be the issue with Eve, right? She's going to think something is good, but her eyes are faulty, whereas His eyes see what is true. So anyways, Genesis chapter 2, just to go through this story basically, verse 4 says, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth. This is the first time we encounter the Hebrew phrase toladot, which basically seems to be the literary structure of the book of Genesis. It's going to be a series of toladot sections, which toladot just means generations. Yeah, and so you're going to see that phrase again and again and again and again. And the first one is the generations of the heavens and the earth. Some people debate about whether or not the phrase refers to what came before or what came afterwards. I think that it's just bridging the gap, right? And so the story before was the beginning of the heavens and the earth, and now as we go into Adam and Eve, this is the generations of the heaven and the earth.
Oh, that makes sense.
And then we're going to see that to where eventually it gets to the generations of Adam, and it begins with Adam, and then it leads to what comes afterwards. And so God creates this garden. He places man in it. It also is worth pointing out for people who try to highlight that there's a big contradiction here between chapters 1 and chapter 2, that this chapter is specifically focused on the garden. And it is not it never makes any explicit comments about the broader world in general. And so we really can't speak about that. There's specifically something all of its attention is on what's going on in the garden and what God is doing there. And so we have to keep our minds on that. But He creates man, right? And instead of speaking him into existence, he makes him from the dust and He breathes life into him. And then He gives man dominion. He does all that stuff. And He specifically gives man one restriction. And that restriction, but we emphasize the restriction. He gives man a great gift, but there is one prohibition amidst that, right?
Yeah.
So, what verse is it? Oh, verse 16, 17.
Yeah.
It says, and Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you may not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. In the Hebrew phrase there, I always like to highlight stuff like this. It's really from any tree of the garden you may, or from any tree of the garden eating you may eat. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it, dying, you will die. So it's really the repeated phrase. We translated it surely because that's a good way of getting the emphasis across. But I like the weight of like, eating you may eat, dying you will die. So there's this contrast. Total provision, but if you disobey, total destruction. Why is it that you think that God prohibits this one tree here? There are a lot of people who will come in here and they're saying that God's just being mean, right? It's a test that they were destined to fail. What's going on here? What do you think's really going on with this tree? Is it some magical tree that literally imparts knowledge to you, or what's going on?
Right, it's like downloads.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I would say it's probably he's just testing man to see if he will listen to him, because, I mean, like we've talked before about, the tree probably has nothing special about it, but through disobedience and eating of the tree, you are learning how it is to be, like, you are learning what evil is, like when you are choosing to disobey. And so it seems like he is testing God to see, or God is testing man to see if he will listen to him.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, especially if you read Genesis chapter 1 into this, right? Again and again, you see that phrase, and God saw and it was good, and God saw and it was good, and God saw and it was good. And so as a reader, we understand that God has the ability to discern when something is good, and he will not move on until it is good, right? Like that is his goal. The defining feature we have seen about him, the thing that he values, is goodness. And then now he says, don't eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And maybe there was something mystical and magical about this tree. I think it was just a tree. But what the tree represented is he's saying, okay, I'm going to draw a line for you here. Eating from the tree is evil. Not eating from it is good. And it all revolves around, are you going to listen to me, or are you going to trust your own judgment, right? Are you going to trust your own? Because as we're going to see in a second, the tree is not unappealing, right? The tree looks good, right? Like the fruit looks tasty. And so he's going to say, whose eyes are you going to trust? Mine or yours? It's going to look good to you, but trust me when I say it's bad. And he's ultimately saying, are you going to listen to me, or are you going to listen to your own judgment? And he says, like, in the message that Moses is saying to Israel is, when we trust our own judgment, things go poorly.
Yeah.
Were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna say two things. One, like, not like, I don't really want to reference too much of the New Testament just because we're focusing on this text, but to contrast with what's going to happen in chapter 3, because you mentioned earlier, God isn't being evil here. He's not setting man up to fail. I would actually make two kind of counterpoints to that. One is a point, like you go to James. James says God does not tempt nor is tempted, but man is tempted by his own sin. And I would say that's kind of the case here. Like, when you contrast with chapter 3, you have God testing man, but then the serpent comes and tempts man.
What is the difference between testing and tempting?
Sometimes on the outside, they may be easy to mistake, but I would say that the main thing with testing is that really you're kind of hoping, like, the one who is testing you so that you may succeed and has your best interest in mind. So when God tests man, he doesn't want man to fail, but he is testing him so that either he may see his sin or that he can prove his faith.
Yeah. So if anything, testing has the goal of evaluation.
Yeah,
right? You're just trying to evaluate where a person's at, whereas tempting has the malicious goal of trying to get somebody to mess up.
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas there are times where in like the New Testament, sometimes we'll translate it'll be the same Greek word, but we'll translate it as testing and tempting, and that always drives me nuts. But yeah, so there's that. Were you going to say something else?
Kind of on a similar thing. And here, like, there's nothing evil about God or the command. And we see this like later on being fleshed out with like the law, where it's like, was the law bad? And like Paul says, no, the law is good, but because of man's sinfulness, a law that demands death results in death from an imperfect person. And so here, like, again, this is the foundation for what is going to become, the full Torah, the Mosaic covenant, all this stuff. So as the Israelites are looking at this, they're realizing, okay, God's command to Adam, it wasn't very burdensome, but it also wasn't evil. He gave him all these things, He was just testing him. But because of Adam's sinfulness, death came. So when they look to the covenant they have with God, they need to remember God's covenant within God's law. It's not evil. It's our sinfulness that requires punishment.
Yeah.
Like I said, that's more fleshed out later on, but it is good just to keep that in mind when you're reading this, is basically just not painting God as evil. God's good, his law is good, but man's sinfulness is evil.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think people run into a lot, and I think that we're guilty of this as well, whenever we read, like there's a passage in Genesis chapter 2, and God gives this tree here, and he says, do not eat from it. We immediately jump to our own personal experiences and how there's times where we think that God's doing something that we don't agree with, and people want to accuse God of being evil.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to read the text like in its own terms, right? And you know that God cannot be doing evil because literally in the previous verses it established, like we know, like you have to remember that this is the introduction to God, right?
Yeah.
Genesis chapters 1 and 2, Moses is introducing us to this Yahweh God figure. So we only know a few things about him. We know that he has a power with words, right? He can speak things into existence. And we know that he has a design. And we know that his design is good, right? Those are the few things that Moses established. So it always drives me nuts whenever people are like, oh, God's being malicious here. Okay, you might think that because you might disagree with him, but I would actually argue that that actually proves the point that's being established here, right? Because God is saying, don't trust your own judgment. You have to learn to listen to me. And sure, maybe once you've evaluated the entire scriptures, you might disagree with him. But again, I'd say that's more of a you issue than it is a God issue. But the one thing Moses has established is that God is good. And therefore, when he puts this thing here, we have to read it through that lens. We have to ask, how does this line up with his goodness? And what is he trying to accomplish here, right? Because again, we're still meeting this God. And we know that he has a design. And we're asking, what is the purpose of his design, right? So we've seen that he isn't doing these things accidentally, right? We saw that with Genesis 1. So he creates this garden. He puts this man in this garden. He gives him all these things. And he says, I've got one rule. And so as a reader, we're supposed to be asking, why would God do this? And I think this perfectly sets up the next story in Genesis chapter 2, because what we're seeing is that God is a God who desires relationships, right? And so immediately after this, literally verse 18, then Yahweh God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. So how do these things connect? Well, because God made it clear, okay, I'm going to give you all this stuff, but I want you to listen to my one, like I've got one rule, don't eat from the tree. And what God is doing is he is laying down the rule to see what man will choose, because you can't have a relationship that is forced. Like this podcast would feel way different if people knew that you were currently handcuffed and chained to this desk on the other side and I was forcing you to talk with me.
Yeah.
That changes the entire dynamic of this podcast. Because all of a sudden you are not choosing to be here and you are not talking of the Bible of your own free will. I am compelling you to do it and I'm giving you no choice, right?
Yeah.
That's a big difference. And in the same way, if God gives man all these things and gives him no opportunity to choose something otherwise, well, then we will never know, okay, did God force us to be this way or what's going on? But instead, God gives, he gives him total freedom, but he says, I'm going to give you one way to listen to me, and it's not a difficult way, right? To quote Moses, I put before you life and death, right? Choose life that you may live, right? Like, it's not that God wants them to fail, but God's going to give them the choice because God thinks that relationships are important, which also should shock us given what we learned about God in Genesis 1. We learned that this God is like the all-powerful creator of everything, and for some reason, he wants a relationship with this man, right? To where you see him crafting him from the dust of the ground and breathing life into him, and now he says, don't eat from that tree. And so he's giving him a choice because he says, I want you to choose me. And I would say that ties into God's desire for relationship.
Yeah.
Then God immediately turns and says, it's not good for man to be alone. Why? Because man is God's image. And if God is pursuing relationship with man, well, then man also must have some sort of relationship, right? So from this very beginning, this actually ties into what Paul will say later on whenever he says that marriage was created to point us back to Christ in the church. The reason why God creates woman is to teach us of our need for him, right? We are his image bearers, or we are his image. And therefore we were made to be relational just as he is relational, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so let's turn our attention now to the story of God creating woman. I've actually talked about you about this over the course of the last week. But one thing that I've always struggled with here is, what is the purpose of this story? I'm not arguing against its historicity. I'm simply arguing, why did Moses frame it in this way? Because if you go to Genesis 1, we see man and woman being created at the same time. And so Moses could have hypothetically just been like, hey, by the way, God created man and woman, and he wouldn't have to identify this story as a unique story in its own right. But for some reason, Moses devotes Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 25 to the creation of woman and the establishment of marriage.
Yeah.
My question that I was wrestling through over the course of this last week, and I think I've arrived at somewhat of an answer, is why is this narrative necessary? Like, why didn't Moses just lump in man and woman being created at the same time and just like move on? What do you think the purpose of this is?
Well, I do think, like what you said earlier, there is also the aspect of God giving man someone or something to relate to in the way that, not in the exact same way that he relates to man, but it does give him some way to express love and having a relationship, and it's with someone who is on more of a level as him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a equal relationship versus unequal. Yeah, I do also think, which I think this is a bit different than what you're thinking, and this is more of like a narrative specific choice. But I also do think that there is a narrative reason that he introduces the need for a helper, and then has woman come along, and then it sets up the serpent story, where the serpent is now coming in and testing woman as well. I think it's also setting that up as well.
Okay. Oh, so it's introducing the woman as like her own individual person to set up the next narrative. Is that what you were saying?
That let's try. Well, like the last time I was thinking about the story, the fact that it kind of separates the serpent from, like, it compares it to the other beasts of the field, but it says that the beasts weren't like suitable helpers. It seems like it's kind of setting up this like dynamic where the serpent is almost like trying to like take the place of the woman. I don't know if that really makes sense, but like from a narrative perspective, it kind of sets up the like if you took out verses 18 through 25, it wouldn't really flow as well into chapter 3 in my opinion.
That could make sense. And also later on we're going to talk about this, I guess, but the phrase hearing the voice shows up a lot throughout this passage, and we're going to see that Adam is going to be punished because he heard the voice of his wife instead of hearing the voice of God. And so it seems like, according to God's design, the woman is supposed to hear the voice of her husband, who's supposed to hear the voice of God. Yeah. But instead, you have the woman hearing the voice of the serpent, the woman, and then the man hears the voice of the woman. So it's literally God's entire structure is flipped, right? Yeah. To where it's going in the reverse, to where,
because he does give man the commandment before woman is created.
Yeah, that's true. Interesting. So my conclusion that I came to, it actually revolves around the word to see, right? A lot of times, like if I have a question about why a narrative shows up, I always look up, like, is there a word that crops up a lot in this passage that might link these stories together? Mm-hmm. And it's the word to see, which does show up, like I pointed out earlier, again and again, Genesis chapter 1. And God saw, and it was good. And God saw, and it was good. And God saw, and it was good. And you see this phrase again and again and again throughout all of Genesis 1. And then when you get to Genesis 2, it says, it's not good for man to be alone. So you've encountered the very first not good thing. So it doesn't say God saw, though. It says, then God said, it is not good for man to be alone. And so you're supposed to be asking, wait, but isn't God supposed to see something first?
Yeah.
Right? He always sees and then is good. But now it says it's not good for man to be alone. So he does perceive something's wrong. And then it says, and out of the ground, Yahweh God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and he brought each to the man to see what he would call it. And the verb to see there is the same as earlier in Hebrew. And so he would see what the man would call it, and whatever the man called the living creature, that was its name. So I think that this ties into verse 16 and 17. Mm-hmm. God made it clear, hey, it is not your job to know good and evil, right? It is your job to hear me and trust me. Immediately after this, God says, oh, I found a not good thing. So it seems to me what he's doing is he is teaching man good and evil on his own, right? So what he does is he says, I have found a not good thing. And instead of simply, allowing man to perceive it on his own, God intentionally brings the animals before Adam. And he is methodically helping Adam see, this is not good. This is not good. There is something that is, we are not of the same kind. Something about the design is wrong. And so Adam is perceiving these things to where finally God says, good, I got you right where I want you, right? He wanted Adam to perceive this is not good. And then he puts Adam to sleep And when Adam wakes up, God has provided the good thing. And sure enough, when Adam wakes up, he says, this one at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be a good woman. Because like basically he's like stumbling over his words because of how excited he is, right? Like it's the first poem in the whole Bible. This one finally is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman because this one was taken out of man. He's so excited. And it's because God provided the good thing. And so to me, it seems like God says, it's not your job to see and know what is good and evil. It is your job to trust me that I can see these things and I will provide for you the good thing.
Yeah, and I guess ironically, or I don't know if ironically, but he is kind of teaching him good and evil a bit in the process.
Well, that's what I'm arguing.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm saying it's like the issue is that the knowledge of good and evil is that the only way that man is going to know good and evil is by doing evil, right? He is coming to know it through experience.
Yeah.
Whereas God is saying, I will teach you the difference between good and evil by teaching you to trust in my design, if that makes sense. So it's not, you don't have to reach and eat from the fruit to experience evil. No, you simply have to know, like, just trust in my design and look around and you'll be able to perceive what is wrong, right? Adam can look and he can realize that a gopher is not a suitable mate for him, right? And so he realizes it goes contrary to God's design. And so God is teaching him good and evil, not through experience, but through faith, right? He's saying, look at this. You see how there's a problem here? And God says, or Adam's like, yeah, there's a problem. And God says, okay, take a nap. Adam takes a nap. He wakes up. And all of a sudden God says, I fixed the problem. Here's your wife. And so it's teaching Adam, when there is a not good thing, God provides the solution. And it's not my job to make a solution for myself. It is my job to trust God to do what is good and to provide. And so to me, if you read the story in that light, it makes sense because there's this contrast. It's not your job to grab from the fruit and eat from it and possess knowledge of good and evil for yourself. It is your job to trust me to teach you good and evil. And if you hear my voice, I will provide. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then it culminates. Basically, Moses draws from this a principle. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife. They shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. What's interesting about that is that it does seem like there's this establishment of like covenant right here, to where because verse 24 is arguably even more out of place than the previous stuff, because Moses, I mean, obviously Adam and Eve, they do not have a father and a mother, right? And they had no place to leave. And so Moses is drawing a theological point from this story that wasn't even applicable to the original people. But the point is that God apparently takes covenants very seriously, right? Man and wife, you're not just buddies, right? No, you are husband and wife. And whenever you make a covenant with a person, you are devoting your entire self to that person. And therefore they leave father and mother. And they cleave to each other. And so the idea is that, like, if that is true for man and woman, and as we've seen, man and woman are pointing us back to God and man, well, then if you're the people of Israel reading this, you realize this is God's terms of the agreement as well. Whenever we get to Exodus, we will see that, like, whenever you get to, like chapters like 18, 19, 20, and stuff like that, 24, God makes a marriage proposal to Israel, basically. And he says, I will be your husband, you will be my wife. And if you read this passage into that context, you realize that God is saying, I'm going to be devoted to you. You're going to be devoted to me. And if you break that covenant, we got a problem. And so all of this is read into the Israelite history. Mm-hmm. But this leads us to Genesis chapter 3. We are already an hour and a half in, but that's fine. We're reaching really good stuff now.
Oh yeah.
This is the famous fall story. Before I start talking, because I will probably have a lot to talk about, what are some things that stick out to you here in this particular passage that you think we need to address? Or maybe let's just start off. Can you just summarize the passage for me? Rather than me summarizing at the end, let's just summarize it from the get-go. What happens in this story?
Yeah, so basically there's the serpent figure that's introduced, and he is described as being more crafty than the rest of the beasts of the field. Basically, he approaches Eve, and he tests her, or tempts her really, but he asks her about, what God commanded about the tree. She responds back. Basically, he convinces her to eat from the fruit of the knowledge of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then she gives to Adam. They eat. They realize they're naked. They cover up. They hear God walking into the garden. They hide. God asks why they're hiding. Adam says, well, we heard you walking and we're naked, so we hid. And then God says, how did you know you were naked? Did you eat from the tree I asked you not to? And then Adam blames his wife his wife blames the serpent, and then the rest of the chapter is basically God addressing the serpent, the woman, and the man, giving different judgments on them, and then he exiles them from the garden, and then he guards the entrance to the garden.
Yeah. Yep. And so, very sad story,
Yeah.
right? One of the most famous stories. Whenever we think of Adam and Eve, we typically think of chapter 3 more than we think of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is when everything's going good. And also, I would remind you that this is all setting in motion the plot of the entire Bible, right? And so Genesis chapter 2, in many ways, is supposed to be a portrait of what the end of the story should look like, right? Genesis chapter 3 is where the plot sets in motion, to where all of a sudden, like, a problem is introduced, and it's going to take the rest of the story to fix it.
Yeah.
But Genesis chapter 2 is a portrait of what things look like in God's ideal creation, right? God is providing, man is trusting, man is listening, things are going great. And then you get Genesis 3. And this is what in most books or cinema or art or anything like that, we would call the inciting incident.
Yeah.
This is where the plot really gets set in motion. And also what's really cool about this is also where God is going to foreshadow how the story is going to culminate at the end. And so let's walk through it. Right off the bat, I'm probably going to turn this to you to just see if you want to talk about it. We have to remember that originally these books did not have chapter divisions, right? We have added those in there. And I think that the division between chapter 2 and chapter 3 is a good one. But there is some wordplay going on in Hebrew between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3.
Yeah.
So chapter 2 ends and says, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And then chapter 3 begins by saying, and the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field, which Yahweh God had made.
Yeah.
And so we've got the man and his wife, who are described as naked, and then you've got the serpent, who is described as crafty. That doesn't sound similar in English, but in Hebrew, both of them are basically the word arum. I think it's like arum and arumim, or like they're spelt the exact same. But then I think one is like basically it's just got like the im at the end. So it seems like if you're reading it in English, you might not even make this connection. But if you're reading it in Hebrew, you're like, oh wow, there's a pun going on here.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to give me a firm answer. What do you think is going on with this whole pun here? Like, because there's definitely a contrast, right? Both of them are arum. What's going on?
Well, it seems like it's, I mean, again, I don't know if irony is the word, but basically the two words are about as opposite as can be. Because, again, we had a story where God basically told man, don't eat of the tree of knowledge, just trust in me. And so you have man trusting in God and showing faith versus seeking knowledge on his own. And so the chapter kind of culminates. It's not saying that they're like stupid, but it is saying like that they are innocent and like they haven't taken that knowledge for themselves. And so in a sense, they are like in that innocent state of like, they're just leaning on God's knowledge. They're not leaning on like their own knowledge. And so they don't have that knowledge like themselves.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like it's kind of getting at. But then the very next verse says, now the serpent was more crafty than the other beasts of the field. And the word looks the same, but in this sense, like a better translation of crafty is more like wise or like
Cunning.
like cunning. And so this is kind of the opposite, where like the serpent kind of in like the worst way possible has that knowledge of good and evil. And so he and in this case he's weaponizing it, and so this is what he uses to actually take advantage of Adam and Eve. But like the words are very like they look the same, but the kind of the whole thing is like they're the opposite.
Well, and also to add to that, just the imagery of it. Whenever you think of a naked person, they're totally bare and they're exposed.
Like they're vulnerable.
Right? Yes, they're vulnerable, they're exposed, all that stuff. But then when you think of like a shrewd or a cunning person, the imagery is of somebody being concealed, right? Like you think of somebody who's like in a cloak and like they're like in the shadows, and so they're the opposite of that. And so the irony here is that they're basically the same word in Hebrew, but the differences make all the difference in the world. To where you've got Adam and Eve, who are protagonists of the story thus far, and then this character shows up and he's going to present himself like them. Like he's going to act like he's on their side. Oh yeah, I'm Arum as well. But no, he's not. No, he's crafty. Yeah. And because that's how crafty people work, right? They try to make themselves seem like they're on your side, but really they're not. And so right off the bat, you realize, ooh, I don't think we're supposed to like this serpent figure, right? Before he's even spoken, which is a whole other thing. Serpents don't typically talk. But before he talks, you already know there's going to be something up with this guy. And so you're already like already just him showing up, especially randomly, right? We never met the serpent before. He just shows up. And the serpent was craftier. You're like, who's the serpent? What's going on here? Like he's another, like he breaks into the story suddenly and like just like ruins the vibe, right? It's like everything's so good and pleasant and amazing, and then all of a sudden, boom, serpent, crafty. You're like, who's this guy? Like, we're on guard, but the issue is we know that Adam and Eve aren't, right? Because they don't know that he's crafty, right? They just think, oh, hey, look, it's a serpent. And that's where it's like, we are more in the know than Adam and Eve are, especially Eve, right? Eve is going to be deceived, whereas Adam just seemingly goes along with it of his own accord. But yeah, so we get into the story. And they have this interaction back and forth. The serpent speaks to the woman. There's a whole thing about, how can the serpent talk? I think the obvious implication is that this is not a normal serpent. We can just leave it there. Yeah. The serpent speaks and says, "Indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden?" And the woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it, lest you die." And the serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." That is only 4 verses right there. Actually, I guess 5 verses. In 5 verses, this idyllic story turns into a horror story. Yeah. Because this short interaction, it might have been longer in real life. I have no idea. But the short interaction leads to the woman embracing sin and her husband with her. And so what I did real quick is I wrote down some things that stuck out to me here, which I've used this before when like preaching. But I think that there are very like what's interesting about this story is that while it does seem to be reporting a historical event, in many ways it also does embody how sin works in general. And so I wrote down things that the serpent does that are typical ways by which we are deceived, and then things which the woman does, which are ways where we make ourselves prone to deception, if that makes sense. I want to highlight these real quick. It hopefully will not take that long. But what's so interesting is that in this short interaction, there is so much going on here, which actually is just practically relevant that I think we should be aware of. And then we can dive back into the story itself. Yeah. There are 7 ways, right? The serpent speaks twice, right? He speaks once in verse 1, and then he speaks again in verses 4 and 5. So he speaks 2 times, but in those 2 times he speaks, there are 7 things that he does to masterfully deceive this one. Which, again, even if this is not the inspired word of God, amazing literature, right? The amount of characterization they are packing into 2 times this guy speaks. Amazing dialogue. Yeah. So first off, he questions God's word, right? He just questions it. Has God indeed said? What God made an absolute, he turned the period into a question mark. Did God really say that? Secondly, he makes God appear restrictive. He says, did God really say that you shall not eat from any tree? No, we know that God didn't say that, right? He said, you may eat from every tree, right? You may surely eat from every tree. But he frames it and makes God seem like he's holding back. Did God really say you couldn't eat from any of the trees? Well, no, God didn't say that. But now all of a sudden, Eve, that's what Eve's hearing. Eve's like, you know what? He did hold back a tree. Like, so all of a sudden it's, rather than focusing on all the amazing things God gave, it's focusing on the one thing he didn't, but it's making it seem like what he's depriving them of is much more than he actually deprived them of, right? He seems overly restrictive. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, he contradicts God's word, right? So the woman responds, and then the woman's like, yeah, well, he said that we might die if we do this. And then he says, you won't surely die, which I think is actually ironic, because if you look at the woman's response, which I'm going to talk about in a second, she doesn't say we will surely die, right? In Hebrew, the whole dying, you will die. She just says, lest we die. Whereas when the serpent responds, he says, dying, you won't die. So he actually more properly quotes God, which is interesting because it tells us that he knows what God originally said, right? Yeah. The woman misquotes him, and he actually corrects her quote and contradicts God's word. He says, you won't surely die. She's like, well, I didn't say surely. He's like, just keeps on going. Yeah. So he contradicts God's word. Fourthly, he makes God appear malicious, right? He says, for God knows that your eyes will be opened, which is true. By the time we get to the end of the story, God will say, yeah, their eyes were opened. And so the serpent is correct, but he's framing how she perceives God. Mm-hmm. Like he's making it seem like, God is withholding knowledge from you because he knows something that he doesn't want you to have, right? He knows that your eyes will be opened. Correct. He does know that. And he knows that is evil. But the serpent is making it seem like it's good.
Yeah.
Fifthly, he misrepresents the truth, right? He said, like, he acts as if the eyes being opened was a good thing.
Yeah.
God knows your eyes will be opened. Don't you want that? Well, turns out, no, you don't want your eyes to be opened. Because the logical end of that is you get to the book of Judges where every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. Their eyes are opened and they are doing terrible things, right? It is better to trust God's vision, not our own. Sixthly, he makes you feel entitled, right? He says, God knows your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. Which is ironic because what is the very first thing that we learned about humanity in Genesis chapter 1?
They're made as God's image.
They're made in God's image. They're already like God. But the serpent says, but don't you want to be more like God? Right? He knows that you'll be like him and he doesn't want that. Well, we know for a fact, yes, he does. He wants you to be like him, but there are boundaries. And God knows where those boundaries should be set.
Yeah.
Whereas the serpent says, I want you to transgress that and I want you to become like him more. Basically, he wants you to supplant God and become a God for yourself. That's a problem. Seventhly, he makes evil look good, right? He reframes knowing good and evil, being like God, eyes being opened. He reframes all of those things as if they're good things, when those are all things that God has established as being bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, what the serpent is doing is he is challenging God's word, faithfulness, and character to shift the authority from God to self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's masterful. And I would argue that pretty much all 7 of those things are present every single time we sin. Those are the ways how we are deceived. But then we have to turn our attention to the woman's response. And I like to call this the very first failed Bible study. Because so far, God has given one command to humanity. And I want to talk about 5 ways where the woman butchers this command.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go back to chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, God said, from any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. In chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, the woman says, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it, lest you die. Here are 5 ways where she totally butchered this, and therefore produced the first failed Bible study. This is why we study our Bibles, folks, so that we don't do what Eve did. First off, she downplays the provision of God. God said, you may eat from any tree of the garden. She says, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, right? Secondly, she downplays the magnitude of the gift. God said, eating you may eat. You may surely eat, right? He gave them total freedom. She says, we may eat. So it's like, yeah, I guess God did allow us to eat from the fruit of the trees, where God says, no, you can freely eat from any of the trees. Like, God gave them so much, she downplays the magnitude of the gift. Thirdly, she downplays the danger of disobedience. God says, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. She says, from the tree which is in the midst of the garden. What's the problem with that, Sean?
Wasn't there 2 of them in the midst?
There's
of the
2
garden?
trees in the midst of the garden, right? What's the other tree?
Tree of life.
The tree of life, which I would hope that you're eating from that, right? That's how you're living. And so she downplays the danger of the disobedience by failing to name the thing what it is. Like, the danger of it is that it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's bad. It's not just the fact that it's in the midst of the garden. It's not like God said all the trees in the midst of the garden are off limits. No, it's the one tree. But she downplayed the danger by not calling it by its name.
Mm-hmm.
Fourthly, she over-exaggerates the requirement of the command. God said you shall not eat from it. She said you shall not eat from it and you shall not touch it. I have seen some people suggest that this was a good thing, but I disagree. I think this is the source of legalism, right? This is basically man adding traditions to God's word as a fence to better following God's word. But how did that work out for them? Because she ended up touching it and eating it. It made it more desirable in her eyes.
Yeah.
And so
Exactly.
that's a problem.
It's like the hedge.
Yeah. Like you can imagine how Adam was like, hey, let's just stay away from touching it. But here's the other issue. God said that they were supposed to keep and they were supposed to work and keep the garden. How do you work and keep something if you're not touching it?
Yeah.
That's a
true.
problem. Fifthly, she downplays the severity of the judgment. God said, in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. And she turns it into lest you die.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at all those things, and I would say that's a bit of a problem. And so those are 5 ways where she just absolutely fails her Bible study because she fails to accurately represent the Word of God. And that's why we don't want to do that, and we want to be a lot more careful with how we handle God's Word. And so long story short, she ends up eating from the fruit. She gives it to her husband. He eats it as well. And then, like you pointed out, whenever you were summarizing the story, they hear God, and they're like, uh-oh, we messed up.
Yikes.
And so they flee. And this is the first time we encounter the phrase in Hebrew, hear the voice. It's like Shema Shema Kol, I believe it is. Like just
Yeah,
hear.
Shema, it's cool.
Yeah, Shema Kol. It's just to hear the voice. In English, we translate it as then they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking, but it literally means then they heard the voice of God, right? Of
Okay.
Yahweh God. So then they heard the voice of Yahweh God walking in the garden. And then whenever God says, "Where are you?" Adam says, "Well, I heard the voice of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And the reason I highlight that is because they hear the voice of God and they run away. And then whenever God rebukes Adam, he's going to say, "Because you heard the voice of your wife," right? So the idea is that Adam is listening to the wrong person.
Yeah.
He was listening to the person that he was supposed to be leading rather than listening to the person he was supposed to be following. And whenever he heard the voice of the person he was supposed to be following, because he'd been listening to the wrong person, he fled from that voice.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's the whole idea of Adam shemad the wrong thing. So if Israel's reading this, they need to learn you need to shema Yahweh, right? And nobody else, right? Listen to God. All right. And so we know the story. Basically, they played the blame game. Adam says, "Oh, well, it was the wife that you gave me. She's the one who gave me the fruit. So really, this is your fault, God, because you're the one who gave me her." And then God just kind of ignores that jab and turns to the woman and says, "Okay, let's play this game. Why did you do it?" And the woman says, "Well, the serpent." And God's like, "All right, cool. We're just playing that game." So he's going to address them in that order, right? He's going to go serpent, woman, man.
Yeah.
And this is probably the most significant passage that we have in our entire section today. Well, let's just break it down. This is what a lot of times people call the proto-evangelium, right? These quote-unquote first gospel. But I want to take our time to explain why we actually have reason to believe that it is tied to Jesus at all, right? Because I think sometimes, people will, right? I even had a student messaging me this last week. They were like, "I do not understand what's going on in this passage."
Mhm.
And I get that, right? And we don't want to just blindly assume, "Oh yeah, this is about Jesus," when it really isn't. So let's walk through it and let's talk about what's actually going on here. Ultimately, what there are 3 punishments. There are 2 sins that are specifically identified, and there are 3 curses that are placed, and 1 hope that is promised. So the 3 punishments are against the serpent, the woman, and the man.
Yeah.
But there are only 2 things that are cursed. Did you notice what 2 things are cursed?
It's the ground and the serpent.
Yeah, it's the serpent and the ground, right? And I would actually I would suggest that the curse upon the serpent and the ground foreshadows where the story is heading, right?
Mhm.
Because to be cursed is basically to more or less be deprived of power, right? So whenever God says, when he places a curse on something, he basically is saying your end is not going to be good, right? A curse is not a light thing to do.
Yeah.
And so whenever he curses the serpent, who ultimately is the source of all this evil, right? He's the one who instigated sin. God is saying that, hey, your power is going to be brought to an end. And then we can talk about what exactly the serpent's punishment is and what how God says that that's going to be brought to an end. But if the serpent is the source of evil and sin, well, him being brought to an end is actually a good thing. So it's a good thing God curses the serpent because that's the foundation of redemption, right? The idea is God is saying, I'm going to fix things. And so since God curses the serpent, we would expect that somewhere in there, he's going to explain how he's going to fix things, right? So that curse is the foundation of redemption, right? Which is a big theme throughout the rest of the Bible. But then the curse upon the ground is going to be the foundation, I would argue, of restoration, right? Whenever we get to the book of Revelation, we're going to notice, even though people nowadays often speak of us going to heaven and just dwelling in like disembodied spirits up in the unseen realm, that's not the portrait that the Bible paints of how the story ends.
Yeah.
The story ends with heaven coming down to earth and us living with God in a new, redeemed, restored creation.
Yeah. New heavens, new earth.
Yeah, and so that would tie into the curse upon the ground, right? This ground, as a result of man's sin, is going to be cursed, and it's going to fight against man. But eventually, it's going to be done away with, and a restored earth is going to be in its place, right? And so I would say that these 2 curses are really the storyline of the Bible, redemption and restoration, right? The serpent will be cursed, the ground will be cursed, and there's going to be this battle for the whole story, but in the very end, the dragon will be slain, and the ground will be remade, right?
Yeah.
And there's going to be a new creation, a new Eden, a new heaven, a new earth, right? And the story cannot end until then. That being said, let's walk through it. So I'm going to read stuff, and I'm just going to ask you what it means.
Okay.
So he turns to the serpent and he says, because you have done this, so that's the very first sin that is identified, right? Because you have done this, namely led the people astray. Because you have done this, cursed are you more than any of the cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go and dust you will eat all the days of your life. What's that about?
I feel like that's probably one of those sections that people debate, just depending on how you define the serpent. It seems like at the very least, it's a sort of like demotion. It's like he is being like humbled like to the ground, and it's like he whether or not this is talking about a literal like serpents now, like because I don't think it's the point isn't about like, oh, now serpents are like on the ground.
They got their legs taken away.
The other legs taken away.
That's what often people will say, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's about that either.
Yeah. But it does seem like there is this sense of like he's being stripped of like some kind of power, like
Yeah.
like the imagery is like in the way that like the word humiliate means to like literally like bring to the ground, like he is being literally humiliated, like he is being brought down.
Yeah. So on that same note, there are a lot of people who are tempted to view the entire story of Genesis as just explaining, hey, like how sometimes you'll see this in mythology sometimes where it's like,
Yeah.
hey, here's how random things came to be. Have you ever wondered why serpents don't have feet? Have you ever understood why women have pain in childbirth? Like some people have they try to explain like that's what this passage is about.
Yeah.
Whereas I think we have every reason to believe that God is speaking about more than those things. First off, it's poetry. And so whenever there's a shift into poetry, you've always got to realize it's using heightened language. And usually it's using imagery to convey a deeper point, right? Like whenever David in Psalm 22 cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Had God actually forsaken him? No, by the end of the Psalm, David says, oh, you have not hidden your face from me. I'm good. He was like, that's how I felt.
Yeah.
And so poetry inherently uses heightened language. And so I do not think that this is simply about why serpents don't have feet. What he's saying, there's this imagery, right? You're going to have the language of dust and eat are going to show up both in God's condemnation of the serpent and God's condemnation of the man, right? And so he says, because you were so proud to try to usurp my creation and make people listen to you rather than me, I'm going to make you lower than everything else, right? You thought that you could ascend up here and be like me. I'm going to make you lower than all the beasts of the field, right? And the fact that he's a serpent conveys that imagery well, because when you think of a serpent, you think of a serpent slithering on the ground, right? And so it works, right? Because that's what serpents do. Serpents crawl on the dust, and therefore he says, yeah, that's what you're going to do all the days of your life. So just as serpents crawl in the dust, so too you will know humiliation and defeat all the days of your life. You're going to constantly try to usurp me, and it's never going to work, right? But then he follows this up in verse 15 by saying, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Okay? And so while the serpent will know humiliation and defeat, there's still going to be a battle going on. And God says that the battles are going to be between two people. Who are the people? Two sets of people, I guess.
The seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman.
Yeah, but even before that, it's just between you and the woman, right? So the two sets are the serpent and the woman, and then their descendants, right? So there's basically he's saying this is not just like a one-time thing, right? You're going to keep on battling in the same way, right? This encounter that we just saw at the tree, it's going to happen again and again, right? There's going to be an ongoing battle. The serpent is going to keep trying to deceive the woman, and the woman's probably going to keep falling for it. But the fact that it's enmity tells us that there might be some victories along the way, right? If a battle is, only being won by one side, the battle's over very quickly.
Yeah.
But he says, I'm putting enmity between you and the woman, and not just between y'all, but between your seed and her seed.
Which means it's going to be going on for a while.
It's going to be an ongoing thing throughout the generations, to where there's going to be deceivers and those who are being deceived. But sometimes the people might actually have victory over the deceit, and they might not be deceived, right? And so this battle's going to go on, but in the end, he says, you're cursed and you're going to be destroyed. So we know how the story is going to end, right? The story is not over until the serpent or the dragon has been slain, and there is no more deception, there's no more pride, there's no more arrogance, there's nobody who thinks that they can usurp the throne of God, right? So we know that the story has to end there, and until the serpent has been destroyed, the story's not over. But then it gets even weirder, because it says between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and so we're thinking seed, woman, and then her descendants. But then this is where we get to be like grammar nerds.
Oh, yeah.
He shifts to the third person masculine singular. He says, he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. He does not say, they shall bruise you, and you shall bruise them. He says, he shall bruise you. And so if he's talking to you, the serpent, then the he would not be a seed of the serpent. It would be a seed of the woman.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's not her and she, so it's not the woman.
Yeah, so it's not the woman. It is a single man from the woman who is somehow going to bruise the serpent on the head, but the serpent's also going to bruise him on the heel. Some people view this and they'll say, oh, well, hey, being bruised on the head is worse than being bruised on a heel. But to that, I would argue that if a serpent is crawling on the ground, I mean, a serpent can't exactly bruise a person on the head, right? If a serpent's going to attack you, where's it going to attack you? It's going to bite your heel, right? And so I would argue that these are mutual, like they're mutual death blows, right? The idea is like, okay, he's crushing your head, but as he's crushing your head, you're biting him. And so the venom is going through and you're taking him out with you. But what's interesting there is that we do have this idea that there will eventually be this man who comes from the woman who isn't just going to take out the seed of the serpent, but he's going to go back to the source itself.
Yeah, the serpent.
Right? Yeah, he doesn't say that he will crush your seed's head. It says he will crush your head. Right? And so this man from the woman is going to come back and he's going to somehow take out the serpent. Which ties into the previous verse where God said, like, you know, you're going to taste humiliation and defeat all the days of your life.
Yeah.
Right? Well, this guy is going to be the one who ultimately does it. He's going to be the one who, like, there's no coming back from your head being crushed. Right? And so there's going to be this guy who takes you out. But at the same time, you're going to take him out as well. And it's like, ooh, okay. And so a lot of people, they'll say, oh yeah, this is obviously about Jesus. And I agree it is about Jesus, but I would argue that doesn't end on a very positive note. Because if you're following along with this idea of this being Jesus, that kind of leaves Jesus in the tomb. Because it's like he got taken out, but where's the victory there? And I would argue that the victory actually comes in verse 16, but most people don't realize it. Because most versions of, most English translations will say, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain and your conception. In pain you will bear children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And so usually people say, oh, well, this is why women have labor pains, and this is why there's marital strife, and this is why husbands and wives can't get along. And I think that's wrong. I think that those things exist, but I don't think you need a judgment for those things to exist. I think that's a natural result of sin. I don't think God has to spell that out, because there's all sorts of other things that God could spell out that he doesn't, right? He doesn't talk about, like pneumonia. Like there's a lot of other things that fall from sin that are not explained here. Right? Like he doesn't talk about how lions and lambs, are in conflict with one another or anything. He's highlighting specific things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess technically you could say that it all flows from like the earlier, like the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Like that, if anything, like that explains why all those things exist.
Yeah, like it's something that naturally flows to where you don't have to go out of your way to explain it. It's not like if this verse weren't there, it's not like somebody would be like, man, I wonder why women have pain during childbirth. So I would argue, based on a more just literal translation of the Hebrew, is that it should be translated, I will greatly multiply your pain and your conception. In pain you will give birth to sons, and your desire will be for your man, and he will rule over you. Because the Hebrew word translated as husband is ish, which is just the word for man, and it can be translated as husband. But in the context of this passage, who is the most recent man that God has been talking about?
The seed of the woman.
The seed of the woman. Well, even more recently than that, the sons, right? It says, I will greatly multiply your pain. I'll greatly multiply your pain and your conception. In pain you will bear sons.
That's true.
Right? And your desire will be for your man. And so while it is true that that word could be translated as husband, you have two references in the preceding verse and verses that are a reference not to the husband, but to the man, right? Like this promised man that will come from the woman to crush the serpent. Mm-hmm. And so this is not God saying, hey, by the way, husbands and wives aren't going to get along and you're going to have pain in childbirth. The idea is God is saying, you're going to desire for this man to show up, and you're going to long for it with all your heart, and you're going to want him to show up and rule. But I'm going to multiply your pain and your childbearing, and it's not going to come quickly. And I think we have evidence for this at the beginning of chapter 4. Mm-hmm. And he says, but eventually that man will come, and he will rule over you. And so I think that the victory of the gospel is actually found in verse 16, not verse 15. Verse 15 ends with the serpent and the man, they have a mutual death blow. But then God says to the woman, that man you desire, he's a long ways off, but he'll be here.
It also makes sense because the last thing he mentioned was the enmity between the seed of the woman and the man and the serpent. And so that kind of implies that there's going to be like we said, if there's like enmity between their seeds, that means that there is like an ongoing long-term conflict. And so, yeah, it makes sense that he's talking about the fact that she's going to be watching her children die and die and die and die. And she's going to be waiting for that moment. That kind of, it contextualizes it a little bit more.
Yeah, well, and also if you just look at the poetic structure, verse 16 ties into verse 14 and 15, and then verse 17 through 19 all go together, right?
Yeah.
Because if you look at verses 14 through 16 together, that is one curse oracle, right? Where God starts off and he says, because you have done this, cursed are you, right? And then whenever he talks to the woman, he does not say, like, he doesn't identify a specific sin that she did, and he doesn't pronounce a curse. But then when he gets to the man, he says, because you did this, cursed are you. And so it seems like whenever God addresses the woman, he's addressing the serpent and the woman together, right?
Yeah.
Like what he says to the woman is a direct result of what he said to the serpent, right? So because he doesn't say, because you were deceived, he simply keeps talking, right? It doesn't even say, and God said, right? Whereas in verse 14, like it says, and Yahweh God said to the serpent, and then he says all this stuff, and then it just says, to the woman he said, right? Then you get to verse 17, and to Adam he said, to where like there's a break in between.
Yeah.
So to me, verses 14 through 16 go together, verses 17 through 19, and they're both two curse oracles. Because the serpent has been cursed, he will be destroyed, and the man who comes from the woman will be the one to destroy it. By contrast, because the ground has been cursed, it will be destroyed, and ultimately because man has sinned, he's doomed to join it, right? And so that's what God says in the next few verses. Because you have heard the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to, saying you shall not eat from it, curses the ground because of you, in pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So again, there's that repetition of eat, 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 dust, dust, dust. Because you ate the wrong thing, you are going to return to the dust. So that's ultimately what he says there. And so I would argue that this sets in motion the rest of the story of the Bible, right? The story cannot end until redemption and restoration have occurred in their full capacity. The serpent must be slain, and the ground must be restored, right? That's where the story is heading.
Yeah.
This then leads to the end of the chapter, where we see that Adam calls his wife's name Eve. This is where she gets her name, because Eve means living. And so basically seems to be him trusting in the hope of God's promise that like he's, in spite of all this, they're going to keep on living.
Yeah.
But then immediately after that, it says, Yahweh God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. And so this arguably would seem to be the first sacrifice, where it's very understated, but the only way that you have garments of skin is if an animal has been sacrificed. And so in direct response to the first sin, you have the first sacrifice, but even the sacrifice, and this is where an Israelite reading this would be pretty shocked, even a sacrifice is not enough to keep them in the garden, right? God has sacrificed for them. He has clothed them, yet they're still getting kicked out. And so apparently the sacrificial system needs something more than just an animal, right? The blood of bulls and lambs and goats isn't sufficient to keep you in the Holy of Holies. And so as a result, God says, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he send forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, therefore Yahweh God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. And so the main reason why man is sent from the garden is because he has, it's because he sinned, but God is protecting them from themselves, right? He doesn't want evil to last forever. And eating from the tree of life is the thing that sustained them. And therefore, they're kicked out, so they can't do that. Verse 24, so he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim with the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. So Sean, tell me, what is going forward, where do we see cherubim at?
The two things that stick out to me the most is the Ark of the Covenant, and then also in Isaiah's dream. They're figures that are associated with guarding God's presence.
Yeah. So when you look at the Ark of the Covenant, you got the cherubim over there. You also have cherubim, I believe, at the entrance of the temple. And then also when you look at Isaiah's vision and then Ezekiel's vision, there's the seraphim. And so you've got these angelic creatures of some sort who are guardians to the throne room of God and the presence of God, which once again would support what I was saying earlier about the Garden of Eden being a tabernacle or a Holy of Holies, basically. And so basically they're kicked out. And now this is the inciting moment of the story to where you realize, oh, so God wants to fill the world with his image, but the image has rejected their God and they have been kicked out of the temple. And so now the whole question we have is, well, how is this story going to be resolved? Somehow humanity has to enter into the presence of God again. And apparently a sacrifice is not enough. They have to somehow learn to actually hear the voice of God. And keep in mind, even in Deuteronomy, Moses says, I'm putting before you life and death. Choose life, but I know you're going to choose death. And so even here, if you're an Israelite, you're realizing, I don't think the Torah is going to be the way we get back into the presence of God, right? Like if you're listening closely, because you're realizing, because the Torah gives a lot of sacrifices, but apparently a sacrifice isn't enough. Something has to change where there's a deeper issue that we need to address. And the answers aren't spelled out here, but it somehow revolves around this man who's going to come from the woman. He's going to be the one who crushes the serpent. And so they're kind of waiting for this man to show up.
Now it's time for Inconceivable, the part in our show when we address misconceptions about the Bible.
I know you probably just heard this in the introduction, but this is a segment of our show that's going to be called Inconceivable. And since this is our first episode, I figured that we would just take a moment to explain what exactly this segment is. And so, Sean, what are we really going to be, like, what's our goal behind what we're doing during this segment?
I guess it's really just to clarify, like, so when we're studying scripture, it's important to know both what it says and what it doesn't say. And so on our main thing, our main focus is what does the text say, and that is our main thing. But I think sometimes it's also good to go back and just clarify things that it does not say. And it's ultimately for edification and to just get better clarification on text.
Yeah. Ultimately, our goal in the end is to think biblically, right?
Yeah.
And the issue is that there are some times where there are just like folk traditions or just like things that are passed down that you sometimes take for granted about the text of scripture that just aren't true. That maybe the text doesn't say it, or maybe it arises from a misunderstanding. And so, or maybe it just arose from like, a Sunday school teacher getting a little bit too fanciful when they were telling the story, and they didn't intend for you to think that the Bible actually said that thing, but you thought that it did, and you've carried it with you, and you've interpreted the text like that ever since. And so this is like, some of these are going to be funny. Some of them are going to be serious. And so we'll be talking through them. And there's probably going to be more in today's episode than there are for a lot of other passages, just because there are a lot of inconceivable moments in the opening chapters of Genesis. But ideally, the goal is to be able to go through these relatively quickly. And if you want us to go more in depth, you can either ask us in the comments, or you can delve into it more for yourself and let us know your findings down below. But really the goal is just to get you thinking, and really to try to challenge you to read the text for itself, because what I've seen in my own Bible study is that I spend more time unlearning what I've been previously taught than I do actually learning new information. Because there's been a lot of times where I've just been taught the Bible in very weird, hyper-specific ways, and I'm like, oh, the Bible doesn't actually say that. And so the whole goal of this segment is to just address things where you might be, you keep using that verse, but I do not think it means what you think it means. And so we've got 10 for today. Like I said, most episodes will not have this many. Some might not even have any at all. But we got 10. And so we're going to start off with probably the most controversial one on here that's going to make many people probably just turn off immediately. But the first misconception about this passage of Scripture is that the only faithful reading of Genesis chapters 1, the only faithful reading of Genesis chapter 1 is that the earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days. What you guys say about that, Sean?
Well, first, I guess the first thing I'd say is just there's nothing in the text itself that seems to imply. There's nothing in the text that just clarifies that, and also that the term day can in general be used in different ways.
I don't know. It says evening and morning, first day, evening and morning, the second day.
Yeah.
I probably need to clarify right off the bat that I do not have a firm stance on how old the earth is. If I did have a stance, though, I would actually lean towards it being younger. And I want to clarify that, though, just because the moment that you say that the Bible doesn't demand a young earth date, people usually say, oh, well, you're just trying to compromise with science and stuff like that. And I'm just wanting to let you know, I lean towards it being younger. I just don't think that is the primary thing that the Bible's going for. And I wrote down here 4 different assumptions that usually lead to this misconception. First off, it incorrectly assumes that the Bible can't transcend a straightforward or basic reading that requires deeper nuance and reflection. They say, well, it says morning and evening, it says first day, therefore it must mean literal 24-hour days. Secondly, it blindly assumes that one's natural 21st century Western way of reading the text is the straightforward interpretation, right? With all of our presuppositions, right? We are naturally a more scientifically minded people than ancient people were. And so we inherently read the text differently. And so one thing I tried to discuss whenever we were going through the text earlier is that I think that Moses had many other things at the forefront of his mind that were far more important to address than simply how old is the earth. I don't think that's a question that an ancient Israelite would have necessarily cared about. I think that we care about it, but even then, I don't fully understand why people care about it. Like, to me, it does not make a difference whether the earth is 3 billion years old versus like 7,000 years old, as long as I know that God created it. You know, so
Yeah.
I've never fully understood that. Thirdly, it boldly assumes that we have a perfect grasp of exactly what the author was trying to accomplish when he wrote the text, right? You're saying, no, he absolutely meant 6 24-hour days. You don't know that, though, right? Yes, there is language that it definitely lends towards that, and I would argue that probably the most straightforward reading would suggest that, but I would also argue there are things within the text that might push back against that as well, especially when you get to like Genesis chapter 2, whenever like you would have to basically assume that, well, I guess we'll talk about that again in a second. Fourthly, it wrongly assumes that the only way to arrive at an old earth is through attempts to conform to modern scientific discoveries. And all you have to do is look into church history to realize that people suggesting that this was not 6 literal 24-hour days is not a modern thing, right? It's not just like post-1800s Enlightenment that this started becoming an issue. You go back to like Augustine, and he devoted books to like trying to figure out like, oh, what's going on with the creation account? Because to him, it didn't seem like there were certain things within the text itself that led him to believe that it wasn't simply a strictly 6 24-hour day thing going on. And so ultimately what I wanted to point out is that that's just a lot of assumptions to build your reading on, and that is not exegesis. The goal of reading the Bible is to interpret it, like to pull things from the text, not read things into it. And we need to figure out what hills to die on, and I find so many Christians die on this hill unnecessarily, right? Like to where they immediately like they cut off other people and almost suggest that they're not fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, all because they don't agree on the date of the earth. And I think that's unfortunate because there are hills to die on, and that's not one of them, right? As long as we agree that God is all powerful, that he created the heavens and the earth, we're good to go. I mean, I guess you could ask somebody why they don't believe in 6 literal 24-hour days. And if the reason why they don't is because they are trying to conform to science and because they are, you know, like being like they don't take scripture seriously, well, then that is a problem. That's a discussion to have. But that's actually a deeper issue. It's not like we're treating like the surface level thing as the deeper issue, and that's not actually the deeper issue, if that makes sense. Do you have anything you want to add to that one? Maybe to clarify things so people don't crucify me in the comments.
We're just keeping in mind that we're not even asserting any single interpretation here. We are simply just saying that there is other interpretations out there. Because part of this series is also just remembering that there are other ways that people have historically interpreted passages, which there will be other ones we'll get to later on where it's not even what we say is right and what they say is wrong. It's just simply like, hey, just so y'all know, like you may have been taught this only one way, but just be aware that for thousands of years, people have also thought this and this.
Yeah, there are other valid interpretations that do not require you to sacrifice biblical fidelity, right? That's the main thing we're trying to get across here. We're not standing for a certain point. We're just trying to encourage people to be more unified and not crucify your fellow believers over hills that aren't worth dying on. All right, second thing that is inconceivable, misconception about the Bible. Humans were created immortal. This one mainly stems. Do you know where this is coming from?
I'm going to assume it stems from the verse where God says, now that he has become like one of us, lest he like eat from the tree of life and live forever, we'll drive him out. Yeah.
So there is a misconception in I would say this is actually a big one in modern like Christian circles where people assume that the reason why man does not live forever is simply because he's no longer in the presence of God, right? He's no longer in the garden. And they seem to assume that basically man was created immortal, and that's why they say that he did die on the day that he was kicked out of the garden, because the idea is that he was immortal, but then God like almost introduced mortality when he sentenced them to death, like then he kicked them out of the garden, and that therefore now we are mortal, but then we become immortal. Whereas the biblical text would seem to suggest that the bodies were the same. It was simply access to the tree of life, which gave them that immortality, right? And so whenever God kicks them out, he's cutting off their access to the tree of life. And so whenever you get to Revelation, and we have resurrected bodies and stuff like that, but it has us eating from the tree of life. And so I just want to highlight that. There are still other implications of that, because like Paul does talk about like, you know, we will exchange like mortality for immortality and stuff. So I don't want to like go too far with that and like make any too sweeping theological like designations, but I just want to highlight that the text never says they were immortal and then they became mortal. It was their access to the tree of life which kind of made that difference, and that's why he kicked them out. Thirdly, Adam named all animals in one day. Do you know why people would suggest that he named all the animals in one day?
Is it just because he creates like the story where he names the woman the story in which he names the animals, woman's created after him, but then they say on the 6th day he created man and woman?
Yeah, so this one is all presupposing that, it is 6 literal 24-hour days, and therefore all the events in Genesis 2 have to take place on one single day.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that there's different ways to get around that. Even though I would argue that this is actually, it seems to be pushing back against that, because I don't think that Moses seriously wants us to consider that Adam had enough time to wake up, work, cultivate the garden, spend some time in the garden, and then like to recognize that he did not have a partner, and for God to say, this is not good that you don't have a partner, so I'm going to bring all the animals before you, and you're going to name all the animals, then I'm going to knock you out for a little bit, I'm going to create woman, then I'm going to wake you up and present the woman to you. That would be a packed 24-hour day. And so I think that there are some complications raised there, but also I would argue that Genesis 2 is just focusing on Eden rather than everything.
Yeah.
But also, my whole point is that there is a way to read it where it doesn't demand for all these things to happen in 24 hours, right? Like the only reason all of Genesis 2 has to take place in 24 hours is if you presuppose the first misconception, that everything has to be a literal 24 hours and that Moses is trying to give us an exhaustive history of the universe.
Yeah.
And so that's like a misconception where it's just like, this one isn't like a really big one, but it is something that flows from the other ones. And there's actually a lot of things that flow from that first misconception. All right, fourth one. This is more of a fun one, right? This is the one where like, if you've been trying to crucify me before, you won't crucify me over this one. The fourth misconception is that the forbidden fruit was an apple. So there actually is, there seems to be a history behind why this one arose. Do you know why that is?
My guess would be something to do with the word pomegranate, because the word pomegranate, like at least in like English and like where it comes from, has the apple in it. I don't remember what.
Oh, interesting.
I don't remember what pomegranate means. It probably means like something like apple.
That's
or
funny.
Something.
Did not know that.
Pomegranate has apple in it, and so I think I remember there being like a thing with Renaissance paintings. Having apples.
So there is a thing with Renaissance paintings where a lot of Renaissance paintings do depict like there being an apple in the tree.
Oh, the Latin malus.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Latin word, I guess it's like the word for evil and the word for apple are similar.
The only difference is the initial A is long or short.
Okay, yeah. So in Latin, the words for evil and apple are just very similar, and so some people think that maybe that is where the tradition of it being an apple came from. And then in addition to that, like in Paradise Lost, Milton calls it an apple. And whenever we think of like a typical fruit, we just think of an apple, but there's nothing in the text that calls it an apple. So again, this is one of those misconceptions. It's not that serious, but it is funny, like how often we like whenever I picture it, I think of an apple. Whereas in reality, like an Israelite would probably not be thinking of an apple. They'd be thinking of like a pomegranate or a grape, or I guess not a grape, but I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know what the fruit was. Long story short, it just says it's the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But apparently it did look very good. And so take that for what you will. Just pick your favorite fruit, and that's what it might have been. The fifth one is a little bit of a bigger one. Actually, I would argue this is probably the biggest one on a soteriological lens, which actually does have very big implications.
I would agree.
And I almost didn't want to address this one now because really it doesn't come into prevalence until the book of Romans. But if you do hold to this doctrine, it will shape how you read the rest of Scripture, and so I figured we could address it real quick. The fifth misconception is the notion that we inherit Adam's guilt. This is a doctrine that some people call original guilt, but some people would lump this into their doctrine of original sin, right? The idea that when Adam sinned, all of us sinned. And so do you know, I mean, I guess I got some notes right here, but Sean, tell me, where does this ultimately come from? Like this notion of original guilt and stuff?
I don't think I was aware. I saw down there, obviously, that Augustine had written something about it. Is that from Augustine, or is that like a historically just like a thing that kind of arose?
So it seems like it largely came from a misunderstanding of Augustine, or no, it seems to have stemmed from an interpretation that Augustine made off of a misunderstanding of the Latin Vulgate. But then he read that into the rest of Scripture, And therefore, now there are a lot of verses that people quote for that, whereas it seems like Scripture is actually suggesting something different. So it all goes to Romans chapter 5, verse 12, right? In Romans chapter 5, verse 12, Paul says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned," right? Well, in Augustine's version of it, right? So I guess it's from like the Latin Vulgate, I believe. The word "because" is "in whom," right? Or that's how he at least translated it, or it might have been that he was translating it from Greek, and I think that Augustine just wasn't very good at Greek. I don't remember the exact origin, but Augustine translated it as, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, in whom all sinned." So the implication is that all of humanity was present in Adam's sin, right? Because he basically interpreted Paul as saying that in Adam, all of us sinned. And then you have like this doctrine of like Adam being like the federal head, and that he represented all of us, and therefore when he sinned, all of us are guilty, and therefore guilt is inherited. And then you're left with the ideas that, whenever you're born, you are born guilty, right? You are already condemned by sin. You have no chance, and you're guilty from birth. And that all flows from Augustine's understanding of it. And then he reads this into like later passages, like, so whenever you get to verses 18 and 19, it says, "So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. For as through the one man's disobedience the many were appointed sinners, even so through the obedience to the one, the many will be appointed righteous." And so Augustine, since he's interpreting this as man being like inheriting guilt, he reads this as it's saying, "For as through the one man's disobedience the many were appointed sinners," in the sense of they were born guilty, right? And then we will be appointed innocent, right? And then he also reads this into like 1 Corinthians and stuff like that. And since Augustine was so influential, this is like a predominant view that probably a lot of churches teach, even to this day. And there might be an element of truth to it, but you cannot get it from chapter 5, verse 12. And if your interpretation of it hinges on that, you've got a problem. Because it all comes from just a misunderstood like preposition, basically. Is it because or in whom, right? Did we all sin in Adam, or did we all sin because of Adam, right? I would argue that because of is the correct interpretation. The idea is that Adam sinned, and as a result, kicked out of the garden, and all of us from like every single one of us also followed in the same footsteps, right? So it doesn't say in whom all sinned, it's because all sinned, right? All of us, like the thing that unifies all of us is that all of us made the same decision Adam makes, right? So it isn't that we are guilty for what Adam did, it's that none of us have made a different decision. Every single one of us have made the same choice, and therefore Adam is the one who introduced sin into the world, and we have continued the process, right? But the reason why this is a big deal is because there's huge implications, right? If you take hold of the doctrine of original guilt, right, the idea that we inherit Adam's sin, well, that's where you get like the foundation for infant baptism, right? Because now all of a sudden, from the moment a baby is born, he needs to be like to where, and I would say you're now putting greater weight on baptism. Because now you have to have something that can get this guilt away from you. And therefore it's like, okay, well, let's say that baptism is the thing that does that. And so now all of a sudden you have to baptize babies because, like, if not, you got an issue, right? And then, I could go on a long rant about stuff. But then, since Augustine also laid down the groundwork for, like, the Reformed and Calvinistic tradition, this becomes, like, the basis of, like, how many people interpret, like, total depravity and stuff like that as well. And those are all, like, big, loaded theological terms that I honestly have no desire to get into right now. But there are huge implications on the idea of us inheriting Adam's guilt, and it all does seem to stem from a misunderstanding of what Paul is saying in Romans. But I wanted to highlight it now because if you don't address it now, then you might misunderstand the rest of the text, because you might be interpreting it as saying that we are all inherently sinful from the time that we are born because of Adam. Whereas whenever you look at the rest of Scripture, it seems to suggest, or actually explicitly says, that God judges a man for his own sins. He will visit the consequences of a person's sin on another person, but he will not visit the guilt, right? And so, if my dad goes and just loses all the family's money, I will have to deal with the consequences of that. But that does not mean that I am guilty of what my dad did. Right? And so we do inherit the consequence of Adam's sin, right? We now live in a sinful, fallen state, in a sinful, fallen world, but that does not mean that, I sinned in Adam, right? And so that's where the issues are there. And so more likely, I would say that we inherited death and corruption, and we are guilty because we sin, not because Adam sinned. And so that was like a crash course in some important theology there. But let's turn to these last 5. We can talk about these a bit quicker.
Yeah.
So sixth misconception. Genesis 3:16 is the basis for marital conflict, male headship, and labor pains. We already addressed this in the main episode. What is the verse actually about?
Yeah, well, we talked about it. It seems like it is directly flowing from the curses on the curse on the serpent, where the God says that the serpent is going to be destroyed by the seed of woman, and then he turns to the woman and says, "But it's not going to happen for a while. You're going to have, I'm going to multiply your pain in conception. In pain, you will give birth to sons. Your desire will be for your man, and he will rule over you." And so it seems like it's talking about a son that she is looking forward to that will defeat the serpent, versus it being, because it also doesn't really make sense with the context of the verses. But.
Well, and also, like, if you're talking about marital conflict and like headship and stuff like that, you don't like that isn't a direct punishment of sin. That's a direct result of sin. Because if you literally go a few verses earlier, you've already seen the birth of marital conflict, right? Adam immediately starts blaming Eve, and so it'd be weird if they're already like in conflict with one another, and God's like, "Hey, by the way, y'all are going to be in conflict." It's like, well, yeah, that's we know we're already at each other's necks, and so it doesn't seem like marital conflict and labor pains are a direct punishment as much as they are just a result of what we've done, right? And so, I mean, I guess if you do hold to the traditional interpretation, then yes, I guess that would be the source of it. But to me, it's harder to explain how that fits in the grand context of everything else God is saying.
Yeah.
And so it could be that we're wrong, but I'm going to label it as a misconception. All right, seventh misconception. Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's first 2 kids, and that there were only 4 people at the time that Abel was killed. This is one that I actually get questions about all the time. So what can we say about this, Sean?
Probably first 2 things. I guess the first question, which isn't the biggest thing, but the first question would be, where did Cain go to then after he was exiled? Because it sounds like
he knew his wife.
He knew his wife, and he was worried people would kill him, and so there had to be other people. But probably the first thing is just remembering remembering Moses's intention when he's writing. And right now, like, in the context of Genesis 4, we just talked about this enmity between the seed of the serpent and the woman. And so we're thinking about that. And so he's not being exhaustive, because, well, that would also be a lot of genealogy if it was every single person. That would be 5 of these in like the first. Yeah. You get my point. Yeah. But so he's sharing what's relevant to the narrative. And so what's relevant to the narrative is, Eve had a son named Cain. I have gotten a man. And then they shared the name of the other kid that he kills. Yeah. So that's the most relevant to what's going on.
Yeah. So people always make the mistake of thinking that this is exhaustive history, and they're like, "Wow, there's only 4 people on Earth. How does Cain have a wife? Why is he afraid of people killing him?" Well, it's because it's not exhaustive, right? We probably have reason to believe that Cain might have been the first son. It doesn't explicitly say that, but the fact that she named him the Gotten One makes me think maybe he's the first one. It does not say that Abel is the second son, but it does tell us later on that Adam had other sons and daughters. And we know that Seth is not born until Adam is 130 years old. And keep in mind that God had given them 2 commands. Don't eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and be fruitful and multiply. Well, they really messed up the first one. And I have a sneaking suspicion that a husband and a wife exiled from the Garden of Eden, they probably didn't have a tough time fulfilling the second one and being fruitful and multiplying. Yeah. And so if you're thinking 130 years out from the garden, I mean, there's plenty of time. And it seems like Seth is the first child born after Abel's killed, I'm assuming, because it says God has appointed him in place of Abel, right? And even that's assumption. I don't know. But there's 130 years in there where that is plenty of time for them to have multiple kids and to populate and stuff. And so by the time Cain kills Abel, there could be hundreds, if not thousands of people alive. If you're just, I mean, especially in the ancient world where people are like getting married at like 14 or 15. Yeah. And so there could be multiple generations alive at this point, and it never says that those are the only 4 existing at that time. And so that's something worth highlighting. Number 8. This is one we can cover really quickly. Cain killed Abel with a rock. This is just one that it's always depicted that way. It's always like he picked up a rock and like killed Abel. It just never says. It doesn't say how he killed him. It just says he rose up and he killed his brother.
Yeah.
And
it's like, he could have just like choked him or something.
It could have been anything, right? I mean, we have zero idea. It just, he did it, right? Like the method is not stated just says that he killed him. And I find that one just funny just because, again, some of these are not serious. Some of them are just like, it's kind of weird. But then some of them do have implications. Ninth one, Abel was the first death. This one's also interesting. Why is this a misconception, Sean?
Well, I guess this would probably tie into number 7 and the fact that we just don't know who else was alive. Like, we don't know how many other people there were, and so, I mean, it's suffice to say that 130 years of people being around, someone else very likely could have died, whether it was from natural causes or what.
Yeah.
But again, that's just not the highlight of the main point of what the Bible, like what Moses is doing, it doesn't hinge on whether it was the first murder or not. It's the fact that it was, it's driving the narrative. And so the fact that it is Cain killing his brother Abel, and especially in the context of what's going on, that's what's important. It's not specifically, now murder's a thing. It's like, it could have easily happened before that.
Yeah. Well, it's also like a lot of these are just us trying to remind you, don't treat the text like it's being exhaustive in everything that happened. Because sometimes I feel like that's what skeptics do too. Like they'll be like, they'll make caricatures of the faith by suggesting that like life wasn't as complex back then.
Yeah.
And so it is possible that Abel was the first one to die. The text just doesn't say that, right? And actually, I just thought of another one that we could have thrown in here: the idea of Methuselah being the oldest man on earth, because Methuselah is the oldest person in the genealogy, and so people say Methuselah is the oldest man to have ever lived. No, he's the oldest man mentioned in the genealogy.
Yeah.
Perhaps there was somebody older. We can't say. Maybe he was the oldest. Maybe he wasn't. The whole idea is that the text isn't being exhaustive, right? For all we know, they had another brother who tripped on a rock and fell down a cliff and he died earlier, right? I don't mean to make light of that, but the idea is that the text isn't being exhaustive. The whole point is that one generation out of Eden, a brother is killing another brother. Yeah. That is the problem. Like, so it's not so much that's the first death or even the first murder necessarily. They could have been, but it's the fact that you're one generation out and a son is killing a son. And moreover, it's the son that Eve was putting her hope in, right? Eve's like, this is the son. This is going to be the one who delivers us. No, he kills his brother. It's like, whoa, like that's the focus. And so there's that. All right, final one. This is a big one that I hear quoted all the time, even to this day. Misconception number 10, man cannot live more than 120 years. It is a cap to where we know for a fact that man will not live 120 years in one day. What's the deal with that, Sean?
Aside from the text itself, which doesn't really it doesn't read that way. I'm pretty sure that like at least Abraham lived longer than that.
Well, yeah. So the whole issue is that you have to basically. Let me answer this by going to a modern example. Literally last week, I had somebody ask me. They're like, "Oh, well, people lived a lot longer in biblical times, right?" But then like they put the cap at 120 years, and that's like an assumption people make, and it just shows you that people do not read their Bibles because. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, God says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he indeed is flesh. Nevertheless, his day shall be 120 years." And people say, well, therefore, people aren't going to live past 120 years. The issue is, that is the start of the Noah story. And Noah is 500 years old when the flood waters start. Or actually, no, he's 500 years old whenever God shows up to him. I think he's 600 when the flood waters start. And then you keep reading it. And Abraham, he lives to be like, I think it's 175. Yeah. And then you keep on reading it, and Isaac, Jacob, they're all living for a really long time.
Yeah.
It is true that Moses lived to 120 years, and so I guess you could argue that maybe like Moses is telling his audience, hey, by the way, guys, we don't like I'm living the max. I don't know.
But that would make sense. Though.
Yeah, the more natural reading of the text is simply that God says, in 120 years, I'm going to flood the earth. And I would actually argue that people's lifespans getting shorter is just a natural result of being further from the tree of life.
Yeah, especially like kind of like we mentioned earlier, like we just take it for granted that like, well, we know that mankind didn't die off in the flood, and so we think like, oh well, it's not talking about that. But you have to remember from the text, from the perspective of how the text is presenting the flood, mankind died in the flood.
Yeah,
the remnant that survived, which is Noah and his family. From the text perspective, it is basically as if the entire human race was killed off. And so when God says man's day shall be 120, he's not joking. Like he's saying that mankind is going to die in 120.
Yeah.
His days are numbered because in 120 years, mankind will no longer be around. And obviously that is like I said, he preserves Noah and his family. But from the text perspective, that's how it's presenting the flood.
Yeah. Yeah. And the main reason I wanted to highlight this last one is just because I've literally seen this one used in like like, it sounds laughable, but I've seen it used in just terrible ways, where I have seen pastors be like, you can take it as a matter of faith that there's never going to be a person who lives 120 years and one day. And if they do, then God's a liar. And I'm like, whoa, be careful there, because that is built on a lot of assumptions that the text is not establishing. Because all you have to do is keep reading the text to realize that's not what it means. Because you just keep reading Genesis and people live longer. And so that's like places where, again, the whole goal of this little segment is to help us figure out what hills to die on.
Yeah.
And sometimes us Christians, and just religious people in general, I guess, we have a nasty habit of just like drawing the weirdest lines in the sand and being like, this is the hill I'm going to die on.
Yeah.
When in reality, God's like, no, you should pursue unity. And like, there are very limited hills that you should die on. And we need to figure those out. And that's one goal. As we read through scripture, we need to find those hills. And we need to identify which hills are the wrong ones.
Yeah.
And so anything else you want to add, Sean?
No, I was just going to say, like you mentioned earlier, it's just, especially when it gets to a point where people are more willing to call God a liar or to call other people like malicious, than to just admit that maybe they read the text wrong.
Yeah.
That's especially when you realize there's a problem.
Yeah. The whole goal is to read the text closely and carefully and shout where the Bible shouts, whisper where the Bible whispers, and be silent where the Bible is silent. And so that's the whole goal of this channel, and the goal of this podcast, and the goal of this segment. So thank you all for watching this. Back to the actual show. That turns us to chapter 4. We can go through these last 2.5 chapters a lot quicker. Chapters 1 through 3 kind of set everything in motion. Chapter 4, we get the Cain and Abel story. Very famous story, but I got to ask you, how the heck does this tie into everything that came before?
Well, we just talked about how there is this the solution to the conflict between, like, the whole sin problem in general. The solution is going to be through a man that is going to come from the seed of the woman. And so the kind of the thing going forward is you're looking forward for the man. And so chapter 4 starts off by saying that Eve conceived and gave birth to Cain, which means begotten. And she says, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. And so right off the bat, when you're starting chapter 4, you're supposed to be thinking about Genesis 3:16. Oh, she has gotten a man.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, that's what she's thinking of.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she apparently has failed. Like, she's heard part of what God has said, but she's missed the other part, which ironically is kind of what we tend to do. It seems like Eve is the first one who's guilty of overlooking the negative stuff God said and focusing on the positive. Right? She's cherry picking Bible verses. So far, I'm just kind of realizing that Eve is not good at studying the Bible. Because God said, I will multiply your pain and your childbearing, right? So it's not going to happen overnight. Yeah. But he does say that in due time, your man will rule over you. And so she has this child, and she literally names him the gotten man, to where she says she gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have Cain, I have gotten an Ish with Yahweh. Like, even the phrase, the help of there, is inserted. Right. Yeah. So it's really, I have gotten a man with Yahweh. And so it's very evident from here, like, the reason she names Cain what she names him is because she thinks he's the gotten one. Like, he's the chosen one. This is the guy. All my hope is in him. But unfortunately, by the end of this chapter, we'll realize that her hopes are crushed. Because by the end of the chapter, she's going to realize, ooh, my hopes might have been better placed in Abel, not Cain. Yeah. Because by the end, she's like, man, Cain killed Abel, so I need a son to replace Abel. She's not looking for a son to replace Cain. So she places her hope in this man, but as we're going to see, this man will not, this man is not the one that she desired, and he will not rule over her, because there's another one who desires him, and he must rule over, but he's not going to do it.
Yeah.
And so we get into the story, Cain and Abel, they offer their sacrifices, famous stuff. Cain's sacrifice is accepted. Cain's is rejected. Abel's is accepted. Yeah. Cain's not happy about this. It says that his face fell. Future David here. Our audio file got corrupted at this point in the episode, and so instead of leaving it in there, I'm just going to give you a summary of what we talked about, and then we'll get back to the episode itself. So basically, at this point, God confronts Cain, and this is what he says in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Then Yahweh said to Cain, why are you so angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is lying at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And the main thing that I wanted to highlight in the episode is that the words for desire and rule right here are the same words that we saw back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. Earlier we talked about how my interpretation of Genesis 3:16 is a little bit different than the traditional interpretation, and the main reason I hold to that is actually less because of 3:16 and more because of 4 verses 6 and 7. Because what God is saying right here is that sin is desiring the man, and it wants to rule over the man, but the man must rule over it. And so the words here are the exact same words. The Hebrew word for desire is teshukah, and the Hebrew word for rule is mashal. And mashal is a very common word. It shows up a whole lot throughout the Hebrew Bible, so that's not a very unique word. It even shows up back in chapter 1, right, whenever it talks about the sun ruling over the day and everything. But the word teshukah is not a common word. It only shows up 3 times in the entire Bible. One is in chapter 3, one is in chapter 4, and then you have another instance in the Song of Solomon. And in that instance in the Song of Solomon, teshukah is not a negative desire. It is a yearning desire that one spouse feels for another spouse. And so just given how this word shows up in the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't seem like desire should be interpreted as this negative desire like people usually interpret with Genesis 3:16, but instead it seems to be describing a yearning desire. Essentially, the portrait that God is painting for Cain is that he finds himself smack dab in the middle of the enmity between the serpent and the woman, and therefore has to decide whether he is going to belong to the seed of the serpent or the seed of the woman. Both the woman and the serpent desire Cain, right? The woman desires him so that he will one day rule over her and be the problem to the sin problem that we met in chapter 3. By contrast, the serpent is the sin crouching at the door, right? This is the serpent that is crawling in the dust and eating the dust. He's crouching at the door, and he is ready to pounce on Cain, and he wants to bruise Cain's heel. But God warns him that if he is not careful, the serpent's going to get his heel. And so he says, you must rule over it. You must bruise the head of the serpent, or else it will bruise your heel, right? This is the challenge that God is putting before Cain, and we ultimately know where the story leads. Cain decides not to be the seed of the woman, but to be the seed of the serpent. And the serpent ends up bruising his heel, and the way he does this is that Cain does not lift up his head, and instead he rises up and strikes down his brother, right? And so you've got this language of rising up and going down. And because Cain's face is downcast, that allows him to rise up and strike down his brother. And so ultimately God will come to him, and because he has chosen the path of the serpent, now he will share in the punishment of the serpent. And just as the serpent was cursed, so now Cain is also cursed, and Cain therefore becomes the first human being to directly receive the curse according to the text, right? We talked about earlier how it was the serpent and the ground who were cursed for destruction, but now because Cain has chosen the path of the serpent, he also shares in that curse. And then the rest of the chapter gives us the genealogy of Cain, and basically we get to see the genealogy of the serpent. So as time progresses, we get to see poorer and poorer decisions being made. And then the main thing I wanted to emphasize is that you see the progression of sin culminating in this guy named Lamech. And Lamech is one of the descendants of Cain. There's going to be another Lamech in Genesis chapter 5, who we will talk about in a moment. But in Genesis 4, there is this guy named Lamech. He's the first guy to have 2 wives. And right off the bat, we get to realize that this is a guy who is very excessive, and he's very good at distorting God's word and learning the wrong lessons, right? God decided to make a suitable helper for Adam, and Lamech decides, you know what, I want 2 suitable helpers, right? So he's perverting God's good design and going above and beyond. And that ultimately culminates in this passage in verses 23 and 24, where Lamech said to his 2 wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my word, for I have killed a man for striking me, and a boy for wounding me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. And so in the midst of that poem right there, you'll notice that phrase, hear my voice, shows up again. So whenever Adam heard the voice of God, he fled, and he was punished because he heard the voice of his wife rather than the voice of God. And now you have Lamech, who is telling his 2 wives to hear his voice. And so this challenge throughout all these chapters is, whose voice are you going to listen to, right? We're supposed to listen to the voice of God, but Adam listened to the voice of his wife. And then now you have Lamech, who is telling his wives to listen to his voice, which is what the husband is supposed to be doing. But then we learned that this guy is a total trash bag who should not be talking, because basically what he says is he learned the wrong lesson from God's divine protection of Cain. Because if you go back a little bit earlier, in spite of all Cain had done, and despite the fact that Cain was cursed for what he had done, God ultimately promises that he will protect Cain. And we get to see that God is a God of mercy and love. And even though Cain has every right to be struck down by somebody who comes across him, ultimately God says, I'm going to protect you and I'm going to take care of you. And he gives Cain this mark. And we don't need to get into what the mark is. People can speculate about that as much as they want. But God provides this divine protection over Cain, which Lamech then goes on to pervert. Because God says that he will avenge sevenfold anybody who strikes down Cain, right? So he will provide this protection for Cain to basically safeguard him from being struck down by somebody. But then Lamech gets the whole wrong lesson. And he says, well, you know what? I can protect myself way better than God could. And so he basically uses God's protection of Cain and God's grace towards Cain's sin, and he uses that to justify vengeance. And he says, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, I'm avenged 77-fold. Cain struck down his brother in a fit of anger. I struck down two guys because they insulted me. And so basically what Lamech's arguing is that the best way to protect yourself is by striking down somebody who even slightly insults you. And then you're going to call back to this in the New Testament whenever Jesus reverses this, right? Remember, you have that conversation between Jesus and Peter. Whenever Peter says, how many times should I forgive somebody? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, I tell you 77 times. So Jesus is correcting the theology of Lamech and saying, you shouldn't be trying to maximize the vengeance you can take. You should be seeking to maximize the forgiveness that you can give. And so Lamech is just this perversion of God's character. He demonstrates just a perversion of God's word and his promises and his provision. And he represents that sin is progressing over time, which leads us back to the podcast itself, right? God can protect Cain sevenfold. I can protect myself 77-fold. It's actually the opposite of what Jesus says. Lamech is saying that he's going to bring vengeance 77 times, whereas Jesus says you should forgive 77 times. But what I want to highlight is the progression of sin. Whenever Adam was confronted over his sin, he did not deny that he'd done something wrong. He admitted to it, but he tried to blame it. Like, he tried to blame it on somebody else, right? So he deflected, but he admitted that he did something wrong. Like, he was not so bold as to deny that he had done something wrong. He's like, yeah, I did something wrong, but really it's the woman's fault and kind of your fault. So he was not so arrogant as to lie to God's face. He just tried to, push off the truth.
Yeah.
You get to Cain, and Cain outright just tries to act like he did not sin, right? Cain's like, I don't know where my brother's at. Maybe you've seen him. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? So you see a progression of sin. Adam's not willing to lie to God's face. Cain is willing to try to act like he didn't do anything wrong. And then even whenever he gets punished, Cain does not show remorse. Cain's like, oh, this punishment is too great to bear. How am I going to deal with it? And you're like, you should have thought of that ahead of time, man. Like, you did something really bad. Like, this is not about you. It's about Abel. But all Cain's doing is thinking about himself.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't see a response on the part of Adam and Eve. They're punished, and then they never talk again in Scripture, right? They just, Eve does whenever she's naming the kids. But, so Adam, he outright says, okay, I did something wrong, but he tries to deflect the blame. He does not respond to the punishment. Cain, he tries to act like he didn't do anything wrong, and when he does get punished, he whines about it. And then you get to Lamech. Lamech, he's not hiding his sin. He's not deflecting the blame. He's boasting in his sin. He says, hey, guys. Hey, honey. Well, I guess honeys. I'm home. There's 2 wives. He says, guys, I'm home, and I can't wait to tell you what I did today. I murdered some people because they slightly insulted me. He's like, look at that. So, there's this progression of people just becoming more overt in their sin. Yeah. And in many ways, Cain's line represents the seed of the serpent, right? You contrast that with Genesis chapter 5, where you have the seed of the woman, where Genesis 4 ends, where it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has set, or Sheth, it's the same word, God has set for me another seed in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. So she begins to realize, ooh, I put my hopes in the wrong kid. Cain's name means the gotten one, whereas Abel just means vanity or fleeting. It's Hevel. And so you've got this fleetingness to where it's like, man, Abel's life was so fleeting, but man, he probably was the real one I should have been placing my hope in. And so she needs another child to replace Abel. Yeah. And that is Seth. And then it says, to Seth, a son was born, and named him Enosh. And then Genesis chapter 5 gives us the genealogy of Seth. What are some things that stick out to you in this genealogy?
Well, probably the first thing that sticks out is the fact, just the overwhelming presence of death, dying. And also, I think, just the tone whenever you're reading through, going back to Genesis 3, I think in a way that we can probably think of with ourselves too. It's easy, and actually this is something that people also accuse of Genesis 3, is that death never actually happened in Genesis 3. You know, like, oh, they ate the fruit but they didn't die.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong, obviously. This is one of those chapters that kind of proves that wrong. But like, you can almost imagine in the scene, you can almost imagine the serpent eating the fruit and being like,
yes,
see, it's fine.
Yeah.
And I think that it's this, and it's the same thing for us. We don't think long term on how sin actually affects us. And there is this like delayed, like, I think from a literary standpoint, there is this delay to where when God told Adam that he would die, Adam didn't need to know what that actually meant. He just needed to trust.
Yeah.
Anyways, but nevertheless, there is this delay to where there is no death yet, but then you see in chapter 4 there is death. That's whenever you start seeing like Cain killing Abel. But then you get to chapter 5 and now you're like, oh, this is like they're dying. Death, and then you get these stories where people are getting chapters or chapter and a half to themselves, and now you get people whose entire story is they lived X years, had kids, and died.
Yeah. Well, I've seen people argue that God is a liar, right? They're like, God said, in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And they say, well, they didn't die on that day, did they? Yes, they did. But then I see a lot of like Christians nowadays who they'll try to put a spin on it because they don't want God to be a liar. And they'll say, well, they spiritually died that day, which I don't know. I don't think that's what Moses is saying either. I think what's happening is that they are being exiled. And in the ancient world, exile equals death. This is something we take for granted in a modern day because, again, if I get kicked out of the house, I can just like, I don't know, if I have some leftover money, I can go to the grocery store and buy some food. But in the ancient world, you are living in a garden paradise. You have never had to provide for yourself. Literally, the ground watered itself and God took care of you. You're kicked out. You are now going into the wilderness. That is a sentence of death, right? It might not come overnight, but yeah, in the day that they ate of it, they did die. Right? Because true life is found in the presence of God. And they're kicked out. And so now he says, yeah, you can go try to find life for yourself, but the ground's going to work against you. So yes, it was a sentence of death. And they did die the day that, but then you do see God's mercy because yeah, they're living 900 years. That's amazing. But it was still a sentence of death and they did die that day.
Yeah. And it's the same thing for the audience, like for the people in the wilderness is, they have to remember that in the day that they enter the promised land and they enter Canaan and they have these commands they have to keep, when Moses says, I have set before you life and death, choose life, they have to remember to think long term and realize, okay, well, just because I won't die immediately for, I'm not going to get smited from heaven for disobeying the law, that doesn't mean that I need to consider the long-term effect. And so like, and that happened, for hundreds of years. God was patient with his people. And then we got to, Jeremiah, and God said, I'm going to do my word. And he finally exiled, he killed Israel and had to resurrect it later on.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. And it's the same thing for us too. We have to think like, just because we're not seeing consequences immediately doesn't mean they don't exist. And this is something that is established here. God delaying judgment doesn't mean he's not just. He still will enact, like, God doesn't forget. If Adam and Eve disobey and God says they're going to die, he's not going to not do that. So when the people of Israel are disobeying the law, just because God might delay ultimate judgment does not mean that he won't do it. Because I think it's easy for us to do the same thing. We think, oh, God won't do XYZ just because it didn't happen right away.
Well, it's also like, that's just the human heart. We always want to know how much we can get away with before God will like turn on us. And it's like, if that's the question you're wrestling through, you are not understanding the point of the story. It's like whenever like I don't know, you tell a kid, don't touch the stove. And they're like, I want to know how close I can get to the stove before I get in trouble. If that's what you're doing, you are not understanding the command. And so don't push it, basically. But yeah, so you get to Genesis 5 and you get this genealogy, and there's two words that are repeated again and again. Right? The Hebrew word yalad, which means to beget or to bear or to have a son. And then you have the Hebrew word mut, which means to die. And God had said to the woman, I will multiply your pain and your childbearing. And in pain, you will bring forth sons. And that's exactly what we see in chapter 5. Right? Basically, you have hundreds of years of life relegated to nothing more than bearing kids and dying. And then the kids that you had, they bear kids and die. Bear kids, die. Bear kids, die. God said, I'm going to multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you will bear sons. Well, they're bearing sons and daughters, and they're all dying. And you contrast this by Genesis 1. God saw that it was good, and he blessed all the living things and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. God wanted the world to be filled with life, but instead it's being filled with death. Mm-hmm. And so all you have to do is read Genesis 5 and realize, something is not right here. If God were to give us his commentary, he would say, it is not good. And so we realize this has got to be heading somewhere. But then there is one exception in the story, isn't there? There's one guy who does not die. He's the seventh one, ironically, because you have the sevens in Genesis chapter 1. And this guy's name is Enoch. And we don't know much about Enoch. There's going to be later Jewish tradition that develops about him, especially in regards to Genesis chapter 6. But it says that Enoch walked with God. This is verse 24 of chapter 5. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. People are tempted to go into like conspiracy mode and just start speculating what this means. I don't think we need to know exactly what it looks like. I think we actually do get more insight whenever we get to Noah, which we'll talk about next week, in a much shorter podcast episode, because those chapters are going to be easier to go through. But what's going on here? Right? I don't need like a crazy elaborate explanation. Just what is the message being communicated by what we see with Enoch here? The fact that, again, he breaks the pattern. Anytime a pattern is broken, it's important.
Yeah.
What's being communicated here?
Well, probably the most notable is the fact that he walked with God, whatever that means, and the one word missing from there is death. Mm-hmm. So it seems like there is a connection between him walking with God and not having to experience death.
Yeah.
And he's surrounded by death.
Yeah, especially when you contrast that with Adam earlier, who was fleeing from the voice of God.
Yeah.
Right? And so then you hear all of Adam's sons, and they're consistently bearing kids dying, bearing kids dying, bearing kids dying. And as you're reading through the genealogy, you're supposed to be like filled with dread. And you're saying, is there any escape for this death? Right? I thought that this was supposed to be a story of life. Where where's the life? Why is it only death, begetting death, begetting death, begetting death? And then you get to Enoch, and it says he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And you're like, wait a second. Can we linger on that guy? And then Moses just keeps on trucking. But what he's doing is he's planting a seed of interest to where you're like, wait a second. I want to know, what does that mean? What does it mean to walk with God? Because apparently walking with God is the key to not dying. But keep in mind, there are going to be people in the Bible who are described as walking with God and they still die. Mm-hmm. But all we know right now is that apparently one's relationship with God is directly tied to escaping the ultimate punishment, right? Cain, he followed in the path of the serpent, and as a result, not only did he die, but he also killed his brother. Mm-hmm. But then you have Enoch, who walked with God, and he escaped death. It's like, that's interesting. Yeah. And then you have Enoch has Methuselah, Methuselah has Lamech, and then Lamech has a son. And interestingly enough, when we get to the next chapter next week, this guy is also going to be described as walking with God, right? He's going to be described as being righteous and blameless. We're going to have to explore that. But Lamech has a son, names him Noah, and he says, this one will give us rest from our work and from the pain of our hands, from the ground which Yahweh has cursed. So this is calling back to Genesis chapter 3, right? God had told the man, in pain you shall work the ground, right? And the ground is cursed because of you. And so Lamech is saying, hey, this guy's going to be the one who brings us rest. What does it sound like Lamech's doing there?
Like he's like prophesying? Or no?
Kind of, partially.
Like he's...
I think he's doing the same thing Eve did, right?
He's like placing his trust in a little prematurely.
Yeah, he's putting all of his hope in this son, which on one hand, I think it's also just like Eve. It's a mixed bag because both Eve and Lamech are placing their hope in what God said. God said that this man would come to rule and deliver them and bring redemption and restoration, but both of them kind of missed the broader point. I would actually say that Lamech has a better reason for believing this because at least at this point, thousands of years have passed. Right? And so it hasn't been overnight. But the irony here with Lamech is that Noah is going to bring a rest upon the ground, but it's not going to be the ultimate rest. He's not going to be the ultimate deliverer. By the end of Noah's story, he's going to be naked and still ashamed. Right? And so the story is not going to be fixed. But Noah is going to foreshadow the restoration that's to come. Yeah. Right? And so in one way, Lamech is correct, but in one way, he's not. And that's ultimately because Noah is not going to deliver people from the serpent. He's going to deliver people from themselves by basically just everybody being destroyed.
Yeah.
right? And so that's ultimately where the story's heading. One other thing I want to highlight before we jump into the first 8 verses of chapter 6 and then wrap this whole bad boy up.
Yeah.
There are names that are repeated in chapters 4 and chapter 5 in regards to the genealogies. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that the author is trying to highlight these comparisons. Like, there's 2 Lamechs and there's 2 Enochs. There's also some, there's some people in Cain's genealogy which kind of sound like Methuselah and Mahalalel, but they're not exact, they're not the exact name.
Yeah.
But specifically, Lamech or Enoch and Lamech. What do we see about Enoch in chapter 4? What is the one thing we know about him?
Did he walk with God?
No, Enoch in chapter 4. So Cain's Enoch. This is Enoch's. It's Cain's son.
That was the guy who built the town.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. It says that this is verse 17 of chapter 4. Then Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And Enoch built a city and called the name of the city, and he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. So here we have the first mention of a city being made, and the city is specifically named after the name of his son.
Yeah.
And so you literally have a person making a name for themselves, right? I mean, it's Cain making the name for his son. But this is relevant because you contrast this with Enoch from Seth's line, who walks with God, right?
Yeah.
And then you fast forward whenever we get to Genesis chapter 11, where you got the Tower of Babel, and you've got these people who are wanting to make a name for themselves, and they are trying to build up to the heavens, and that's going to be contrasted by Abraham, who is called to walk with God and be blameless and righteous.
I see.
And so you've got these, again, seed of the serpent, seed of the woman, right? On one hand, you've got Cain's Enoch, who makes a name on the earth, and then you have Seth's Enoch, who walks with God and therefore makes a name in heaven, right? He's literally taken up. He's taken away.
Yeah.
Cain's Enoch is planting his feet in the ground, whereas Enoch is literally just taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Lamech, who Lamech is the one from Cain's line who we talked about. He distorted God's word, right? Because God promised divine protection to Cain, and Lamech says, you know what? I'm going to use that as divine permission to go do whatever I want, and I'm going to murder people. And so you have the Lamech from Cain's line who distorts God's word, but then you have the Lamech from Seth's line who trusts God's word. And he says, I think that this son is going to be the one who brings us rest. And so you have these, again, you have the seed of the serpent, seed of the woman, and both of them are building up to something, right? Like you're seeing the battle lines being drawn, and they're in enmity with one another, which is exactly what God promised in chapter 3.
Yeah.
This leads us to the first 8 verses of chapter 6, which are our final verses for today. And they're probably the most controversial, but we're not going to spend as much time on it as we did the earlier stuff, because in this case, I think that sometimes the controversy distracts from the main point. It's like missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Most people call these the Nephilim verses. I'm going to call these the second fall, right?
Yeah.
We think of Genesis 3 as the first, like the fall of man. I would actually argue that there are 3 fall stories in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. The first one's Genesis 3, and this is the second one. So we read, now it happened when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. And Yahweh said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is indeed flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Sean, who are the sons of God? I'm just going to throw it out to you. I want you to give me all the answers right here, right now.
Right now. Well, obviously. Okay. Well, I guess there's like 3 main different theories, interpretations people give. One of them is royalty, so I guess this just would be like worldly rulers, like kings. The second one would be, some people interpret the sons of God as being from the line of Seth, so Sethites. And the third would be divine beings.
Yeah.
I try not to use the word angel just because of the fact that angel doesn't necessarily mean divine being.
Yeah, it means more like messenger.
But like Elohim.
Yeah. So I'll list out some of the pros and cons here. Ultimately, I'm just going to put all my cards on the table. I think that we have very good reason for being confident that this is referring to divine beings, as in angelic creatures, if that's the term we want to use.
Yeah.
But I do want to at least mention the other 3 interpretations, just so that you can wrestle through it yourself. So yeah, like you said, the first one is just royalty. The idea that whenever it talks about the sons of God here, it is talking about royal kings, and the daughters of men would just be regular, everyday women, I guess. And the pros to this argument would be that in the ancient Near East, there were times where royal figures could be called sons of God. And if you adopt this position, that would basically keep everything human, and it's a lot more theologically comfortable, right? The idea is that it's saying corrupt government officials decided to take, regular women for themselves, which isn't beyond the realms of possibility, right? And it also keeps with the themes of like violence and oppression and people making a name for themselves.
Like Lamech type thing.
Yes. So there is some consistency there. The main issues with this view is that there is no other time in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible where this phrase shows up in that particular way, right? So while you do in the ancient Near East see the sons of God being used in that way, sometimes, and even then it's kind of rare, you see the notion of like divine kings, I guess. You don't see that phrase showing up in the Hebrew Bible at all. And so you're kind of having to import all the information from other outside sources. And then also I would argue that, and this is going to apply to the second view as well, it doesn't exactly explain the Nephilim, right?
Yeah.
You're just saying that it's like the kings mating with regular women all of a sudden produced like some total hybrid. Like it doesn't explain why these people were men of renown. It doesn't explain why they are called as their own class of people. That isn't fully explained. And then the third con I would say is that it just feels contextually imposed. Like it doesn't make the most natural sense. Like if you want to make it work, it can work, but it's not a natural reading of the text. Arguably, the more natural reading of the text would be the Sethite view, right? And that would be the idea that the sons of God are, if you're looking at Genesis chapter 4, like Cain's genealogy as being the the seed of the serpent, and then you're looking at the Genesis 5 as being the seed of the woman, well, then it would suggest, like this view holds, that the sons of God are the blessed seed promised through the woman, and then the daughters of men would be the cursed seed of the serpent. And that there is a way where you could argue that, because on one hand, it does fit the thematic thrust of the enmity that's being established, right? Genesis 3 promises enmity. Chapters 4 and 5, we get to see the battle lines being drawn. And then right here, you could almost argue that there's like this clashing. It's like, okay, well now you've got like them intermingling to where the Seth, like even the family of God is intermingling with like these horrible people. Again, I'm not convinced by that, but you could at least argue that is like a theme.
Yeah.
It fits the whole seed of the woman, seed of the serpent context. And again, like the first point, it keeps everything human, right? So it's very comfortable if you're just saying, oh, well, like it might even tie to like later stuff in the Bible about like intermarriage and stuff. It's like, being unequally yoked, right? It's like, oh, well, these people were unequally yoked. The sons of God are, the Sethite people. And like you could argue that could be a consistent theme throughout Scripture. And it also would highlight the total corruption because it would point out that even the blessed line is being corrupted, which could explain why God feels the need to judge. But to me, there are several cons here as well, which would ultimately lead me to just totally discounting this view. One is that we never see this phrase, once again, being used like this throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. There's not a single time where the phrase sons of God is employed to describe the Sethites. And it just seems like that would seem very random. Like you would think that if this is how we're going to refer to them, we should refer to them like that consistently, just to establish a theme to make it clear, whereas that is not the case. And then it would also make the daughters of men redundant, because it would suggest that, like, if it says sons of God and they're intermarrying with other people, like, why does it say daughters of men? It should just say, like, daughters of Cain or something, like, because that would suggest that the daughters, like, the sons of God are also humans. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well, because the first part, very first verse says, now it happened when men began to multiply and daughters were born to them. So it seems like that's just including all men.
Yeah, so it would be a weird contrast to where, like, verse 1 is referring to all humanity, but then all of a sudden verse 2 is saying, well, actually, like it doesn't distinguish between these. It seems like the men of verse 1 is the men of verse 2, right? So it's all humanity and they're intermingling with something else.
Maybe if the and daughters were born to them wasn't in verse 1, you could just say, like, when men began to multiply, and then it could be like, then the sons of God and the daughters of men, and they're both men.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that it says and daughters were born to them is like, no, like daughters of men is daughters of men.
Yeah. And then the third thing also is just, this wouldn't explain the Nephilim. Like, again, if you just have two types of humans breeding together, even if they're unequally yoked, it doesn't explain why these, like, hybrid figures became great men of renown, why they are called their own class of people. Like, it's just very awkward. Whereas, to me, the third view, which is the divine view, this is the one that makes the most sense, to where there are a lot more pros and a lot more pros and a lot less cons.
Yeah.
first off, this matches the usage that we do see in the Hebrew Bible. When you go to the book of Job, which traditionally was written around the same time period, you have sons of God who are coming before God in heaven, and these are very clearly divine figures. And so that matches there. Secondly, whenever you look in general to ancient Near Eastern religious texts, the phrase son of God or sons of God, it more often refers to divine figures than it does to kings. And so that's generally how the term was being employed.
Yeah.
Thirdly, it explains the Nephilim, right? If these are divine figures who are mating with human figures, it explains why these other people are like hybrid figures who are men of great renown, but also like are their own class of people, right? To me, that would make sense. Fourthly, this matches the early Jewish interpretation. Whenever you look at how Jewish people between the Old and the New Testaments interpreted this, like Enoch and stuff, like First Enoch, they interpreted this as being clearly divine. Fifthly, it seems like the New Testament authors, the apostles, they also interpreted this as divine. And as a Christian, I don't really feel comfortable pushing back against the apostles. Like, I'm going to kind of hold their view unless I have unless I have good reason to reject it. And even then, if I had good reason to reject that, then that leads you down like a dangerous path to where you're having to reject a lot of stuff that they say and everything goes into question. The apostles seem to me to hold in a very clearly divine view. And so I'm not totally comfortable pushing against that. And then I would actually I would say that this highlights the corruption that demands the need for the flood even more.
Yeah.
Because it's pointing out, we were talking about this before, not on the podcast, but on our own. But way back in Genesis 1, God he's separating things into their kinds, right? Yeah. And everything, like he goes out of his way to make sure that Adam has a suitable partner for himself, right? He makes it very clear, Adam, you're not supposed, like, obviously you don't mate with these animals, right? You don't mate with lower beings. But then now you have higher beings, right? Angelic beings, divine beings, and they are mating with lower beings. And we already know from Genesis chapter 2, that's a no-no. You don't do that, right? And so once again, you have this breach of a boundary to where God has established kinds and he's separated things into their own classes, but now you have these figures who are transgressing that. And I think this is consistent with Genesis chapter 3 because there's these three phrases that are repeated, right? Whenever you go back to Genesis 3, we didn't actually cover this verse because I was wanting to save it for now. But whenever Eve actually sinned, it specifically says, like, after the serpent responded to her, it says, verse 6 in chapter 3, then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. So what we see there is what the New Testament will call the desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, and pride of life, right? She sees that it was good for food, so her appetite craved it. It was a delight to the eyes, so her eyes thought it was good, and it was desirable to make one wise. So there was something that she selfishly thought she could benefit from it. That's what causes her to eat the fruit. But it's the phrase saw, good, and took that's really important here, because those same words are repeated in Genesis 6:2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took wives for themselves. And so Eve, this is the theme of seeing, right? Whenever God sees something, he's the one who has the authority to say that something is good. Whenever other people see something and they declare something good apart from God, we have a problem because now you've crossed a boundary, right? Yeah. God called it evil, you called it good, that's sin. So Eve, she knows that this eating from this fruit is evil. She sees it, she calls it good, and therefore she takes for herself, right? She has crossed the boundary that God established. Now you have the sons of God. They see that these daughters of men are good, even though we know from Genesis chapter 2 that higher beings are not, it's not suitable for you to mate with a lower being, right? And so you've got these angelic divine figures. They look down and they say, we like that. And we know that's bad. Like, it's very clearly bad. And like literally the first time we even see like whenever God makes Eve, it's right after God says, it's not good for man to be alone. Mm-hmm. And he says, okay, but I'm not just going to give you anybody to be a partner. You need somebody who is suitable for you. Yeah. And so we know that mating with a unsuitable person, very bad. And now you have these angelic figures. They see something, they call it good, and therefore they take it for themselves. So is that crossing that same boundary? And so you literally see the collapse of all creation, right? Because it's not just the earth itself, which is in rebellion against God. Now the heavens have joined in as well. And so this would further demand the need for a flood. Because now all of a sudden, like, you've got these literal hybrid figures of like divine human, like demigod type figures who are running around. And that's a problem, right? Because this is like a testament to how evil people have become.
Yeah.
So do you have anything you want to add to that? That's kind of just like a probably longer explanation than I needed to give, but there's like the views, and that's kind of where I would land at the divine thing. But anything you want to add?
Probably not to that, just because, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the main focus of the passage. I do think that it is worth like discussing because it is something that people take and run with, but
Yeah.
and because it is like it does set up like the flood, but
Yeah, people get very conspiratorial when it comes to this passage, and like they'll read the Nephilim into like everything.
yeah, I mean like it's there, but
Yeah.
it's not there a whole lot.
I think that the main thing is the whole saw, good, took, because it's emphasizing it's a second fall, right? And if the first fall demanded judgment, well, the second fall demands even greater judgment, right? Because now it's not just two people who have sinned, it's all of humanity joining together with, I mean, like in Genesis chapter 3, you have this serpent who seems like some sort of divine figure, right? It's a talking serpent after all. And it is leading people into sin, right? So the serpent is convincing the woman to sin, but now you have what I would argue is this intermingling where now they are sinning together.
Yeah.
And it's not just one serpent, one woman, it's the seed of the serpent and the seed. It's like, it's all of these things coming together to produce sin.
Yeah. It's like, this is the point where God realizes that to not do something that right now that would become evil.
Yes.
They would become evil. Just like, again, if you compare this to Israel's history as a whole, like he sent them in like little mini exiles throughout Judges and throughout like Kings and stuff, where he would, sell them into foreign hands or like different smaller things.
Yeah.
But there was a point where he was like, to allow this to go on longer would become evil.
Yeah.
And so he had to like completely exile, and it was like a total death of the nation.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the same thing. He's done things here and there, like he's punished the serpent, he's punished Cain, and so he hasn't obviously been okay with what's going on. But he's allowed chapters, halfway through 4 with, all the way through Lamech, and then all these people, he's allowed all this to go on, and it's just gotten to a point where he has to do something now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that leads to the verse 3 where he says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is indeed flesh, and his days will be 120 years. So he says, in 120 years, I'm sending a flood. And so he's going to wipe them out.
And you could even argue that this is like the ultimate, like, I mean, I guess not ultimate, just because, I mean, Noah is preserved, but this is almost like the ultimate fulfillment of the Genesis, like in that day you will die. Like this is the time when like, as far as like this text is concerned, it is essentially that mankind's wiped out.
Yeah.
He is like starting over. And so again, like for the immediate audience, there was this delay, but God ultimately did carry his word out. And so again, they have to be thinking like, we need to be faithful, because God may not punish us now, but maybe our next generation or in the future, he is going to actually, like this is how far he's willing to go.
Yeah.
For sin.
Well, and that leads us to what I would argue is one of the most heartbreaking verses it's easily the most heartbreaking verse in this passage, probably.
Yeah.
Verse 5. Then Yahweh saw that the evil of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
Yeah.
Every word in that verse gets worse. But especially if you read this in light of Genesis chapter 1, right? God saw and it was good. God saw and it was good. God saw and it was good. And creation is only complete when God saw that it was very good. But now God looks and he sees, but what he sees isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at the man which he created. In Genesis chapter 1, after he created man, he said, this is very good. Now he looks at man and he can't find anything good. It says he saw that the evil of man was great on earth. And so if very good was the sign that creation was complete, completely evil is the sign that creation needs to be undone.
Yeah.
Right? Where he says, okay, we're going to do this again. And this is it's going to be a one-time thing, but he's doing it to send a message to future people. Again, like especially to the Israelites, you have to hear me. Right? I will exile you. I will punish you. I will kill you. But if you listen to me, I will give you good things. Like it's like the whole thing is like he's like, I want to give you good things. Stop rebelling against me. He's getting frustrated. But yeah, that whole verse, he saw that the evil of man was great on earth. Right? So again, people like they try to portray God like he's like this evil, vindictive person. No, the reason why he sends the flood is because evil is great. Right? Yeah. He wants goodness. He wants life. The reason he sends the flood is because evil has become so great. Right? And he looks and he sees every intent of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. And as a result, we get to see how this makes God's heart feel. Yahweh regretted that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. right? And so here you've got this contrast, right? God sees and he knows the true difference between good and evil. And that's what makes him able to perceive what is real and true and good in his heart. Humanity, though, we see incorrectly, right? And we like to call evil things good and good things evil.
Yeah.
And we don't like to hear the voice of God, and we like to chase after all these other things. And as a result, our hearts are only evil continually, right? Because we're constantly doing our own things, because we're chasing after something we were never supposed to have, right? We're trying to be the ones in charge. We're trying to decide what is right, what is wrong. That was never our responsibility. Our I don't know. That's like the Mona Lisa deciding to make herself better. She can't do it, right? She's not the creator, right? The creator is the one who designs how she should be, what she should do, what her purpose is.
Yeah.
Right? The creation, it's not our job to do that. And that's where you have this issue where creation decided to take the reins for itself, and God's like, man, I would have much rather you just let me take the reins. But this is also, it's the result of him wanting people to choose, right? And that's why it's so heartbreaking, because he didn't have to give us a choice. He didn't have to put the tree, right? He could have said, you're going to do what I say no matter what. But he gave man a choice, and they chose wrongly. And now, at this point in the story, you're getting to see what the consequence of that is.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like people try to accuse oh, well, God he just wants us to listen and bow in submission because he's a big old jerk. No, it's not. This is what happens when we don't listen. Right. When we do not listen, bad things happen. Yeah. And God looks, and he is being as merciful as possible. He lets it go on for thousands of years, but then he looks, and there's nothing good left to be found. And so he says, what am I going to do? I guess I got to wipe it out. Right. And it's not because he wants to, but it's because this is not the goal. Right. They consistently chose the wrong thing. And if you consistently choose the wrong thing, all right, well, I'll start again, and maybe the next generation will do better. And so that's kind of where the story is heading.
Yeah.
And then the cool thing is, so he says at the end, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from the animals, the creeping things, to the birds of the sky, for I regret that I have made them. So it's the way that this section ends is it's really poetic, given how the story started, right? Everything God created, he says, I'm gonna remove it, right? He's literally just reversing the process.
Yeah.
But then you have one verse at the very end, but Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. And it's like, ooh, where's that story heading? And we're ultimately going to see that the end of that story next week. And we'll go through the flood, and I think we're going all the way through the end of chapter 11. So we'll get through the flood and Babel and all that stuff. But Sean, it's been a long discussion. Do you have anything you want to add as we wrap up for today?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm actually good.
All right, cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Like I said, this was a much longer. We're almost at 3 hours right now.
Nice.
Which honestly, I'm not surprised by that. I expected this one to be probably the longest episode that we had to do, just because there is so much to cover. And honestly, there's so much more we could have covered. I was just looking at my notes, and I was like, we're not going to get to all of this, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
But I would encourage y'all, if you're watching this, to go back to these passages, and even though we just spent 3 hours talking through it, realize that we easily could have spent 3 months talking through this. And I've been really enjoying it on a daily basis. We're reading through these ahead of time. We're on a reading schedule with our church and stuff. And I've been enjoying every single day for the passages that we're in, spending multiple hours. The cool thing is that since I work for the church, I have the luxury of doing that. I know not everybody has that amount of time, but the amount of depth there is to take out of these verses and stuff, I would encourage you to just dive as deep as you can into it, because there is some really cool stuff. Yeah. And even though this was a long discussion, we have far from covered all the main things, and I would much prefer to just sit here and talk for 7 hours more, but you've got work you got to get to in a little bit. And yeah, so Sean, thank you for sitting down and talking through the text with me.
Yeah, of course.
If you made it this far, thank you for watching as well, because that's even crazier. I can't stand to listen to myself. I find it crazy that other people would ever want to listen to me. But yeah, thank you all for that as well. And until next time, my name is David Tate.
And I'm Sean Powell.
And this has been Talking Through the Text. We will see y'all later. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Talking Through the Text. If you enjoyed this episode and want more like it, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Stay tuned for more episodes coming your way. Until next time, keep talking through the text.